Damian Simmons was 37 years old and ran a small auto restoration garage on the east side of Columbus, Ohio. Most people saw grease on his sleeves, a rusted Ford pickup, and a man who still ate cold sandwiches beside a tool cabinet during lunch breaks. Vanessa Carter's friends believed she had outgrown him long ago. What they didn't know was that Damian had sold his late father's 1969 Mustang 3 days earlier to pay for Walter Carter's emergency heart surgery at Riverside Methodist Hospital. The recovery ward smelled like bleach and stale coffee when Damian pushed the door open and saw Vanessa smiling beside a man in a navy Tom Ford suit whose hand already rested on her lower back. Before we continue, drop your country and local time in the comments. I always like seeing where people are watching from. And if you enjoy slow burn stories about betrayal, quiet revenge, and hard-earned justice, subscribe. Now tomorrow's story gets even colder. Simmons Auto and Restoration sat between a tire warehouse and a boarded-up laundromat on East Fifth Avenue in Columbus. The sign above the garage had lost 2 letters sometime during the winter of 2019. Most customers never noticed. The regulars knew the place by the smell before they saw it anyway. Burned motor oil, cold metal, coffee that had been sitting on a warmer since sunrise. Damian Simmons unlocked the side door every morning at 6:15 sharp. No employees yet, no radio, no unnecessary noise, just fluorescent lights humming awake over concrete floors stained dark from 20 years of engine fluid. 3 projects sat inside the garage that Thursday morning: a black Chevy Nova with its front suspension removed, a faded blue Dodge Charger waiting for paint, and the empty space in the far corner where the Mustang had lived for almost 16 years. Damian looked at that space longer than he meant to. Then he set his coffee down beside the toolbox and got back to work. People who barely knew him thought he was emotionless. They saw a quiet mechanic with rough hands and assumed there wasn't much underneath. But silence had never meant emptiness with Damian. It meant control. His father taught him that. Frank Simmons had owned the garage before him. Vietnam veteran, thick hands, slow temper, the kind of man who believed paperwork mattered more than promises, and that a man should never speak louder than necessary. The Mustang had belonged to Frank. A 1969 Ford Mustang Fastback in deep metallic gray with white racing stripes and a rebuilt 428 Cobra jet engine. Father and son restored it together over 8 years. Every scratch on the frame carried memory. Damian remembered being 14 years old under those garage lights, while Frank handed him a wrench and said, "Don't rush clean work." He remembered late summers driving through Columbus with the windows down and old Lynyrd Skynyrd songs playing through cracked speakers. And he remembered the hospital room where Frank died from pancreatic cancer in 2017. Keep the car, his father had whispered through dry lips, even if everything else goes. Damian had kept that promise for nearly a decade, until Vanessa called him 3 nights earlier. The call came at 1:12 a.m. Damian had been asleep on the couch in the small office behind the garage when his phone vibrated across the desk. Vanessa was crying before he could even say hello. "Damian, it's my dad." Her voice sounded thin, panicked, different from the sharp corporate confidence she used at dinner parties and networking events. What happened? He collapsed at home. A shaky breath. Massive blockage. Riverside says he needs surgery immediately. Damian sat upright. How bad? They need $80,000 up front before insurance finishes approval. Her voice cracked harder now. Mom's losing her mind. We don't have access to enough liquid cash right now. He stood without realizing it and stared through the office window toward the dark garage floor. When's the surgery? Morning. Damian already knew the answer before she asked. Can you help us? No hesitation, no negotiation. What's the hospital account information? Vanessa went quiet for a second, almost surprised the question had come so fast. Damian. Send it. The collector from Cincinnati arrived less than 10 hours later. Harold Jensen wore a camel overcoat and leather driving gloves despite the mild weather. Wealthy men who collected vintage cars always dressed like they were entering magazine photo shoots. He circled the Mustang slowly. Original body? Damian nodded. Matching numbers. Yes. Harold crouched near the rear wheel, inspecting the chrome. You know this car is worth more than your asking price. I know. Then why sell it in one day? Damien wiped his hands on a rag. Family emergency. Harold studied him for a moment longer, smart enough not to ask more. The final offer came in at $38,000 below market value. Enough to move quickly, not enough to be fair. Damien signed anyway. The hardest part wasn't the paperwork. It was the keys. They sat heavy in his palm while Harold's driver backed the enclosed trailer into the alley behind the garage. Damien walked around the Mustang one final time. The hood reflected the pale Ohio sky. Tiny scratches near the passenger side mirror from a road trip 15 years earlier. The faint smell of leather and engine cleaner inside the cabin. His father's fingerprints probably still existed somewhere beneath the steering wheel. Damien rested one hand on the roof, just once. Then he handed the keys over. The trailer doors closed with a metallic slam that echoed through the alley like a vault locking shut. By 4:42 p.m., Damien wired $86,417 directly to Riverside Methodist Hospital. He didn't send Vanessa a screenshot, didn't ask for repayment terms, didn't mention the Mustang. The only response came 20 minutes later. Thank you. Seriously, no heart emoji this time. No love you, just words. That night, Damien stayed at the garage until nearly midnight, rebuilding a carburetor he didn't need to finish yet. His hands worked automatically while his mind stayed somewhere else entirely. At 12:08 a.m., another message arrived. Surgery starts at 6:30. Dad asked about you. Damien stared at the screen for a long time before typing back. Tell him I'll visit tomorrow. He never sent more than that. The next morning arrived gray and wet across Columbus. Rainwater slid down the garage windows while Damien locked up early for the first time in months. He cleaned the grease from under his fingernails twice before giving up entirely. Some stains lived deeper than soap could reach. On the drive to Riverside Methodist Hospital, his old Ford F-150 rattled every time he hit 40 miles per hour. The passenger seat held a small bouquet of white carnations wrapped in cheap plastic from the hospital gift shop. Walter Carter liked simple flowers. Damien remembered that. The cardiac recovery floor was quiet except for distant monitor beeping and rubber soles squeaking against polished floors. Nurses moved calmly beneath fluorescent lighting. A television somewhere played muted daytime news. Damien adjusted the sleeves of his dark work jacket and walked toward room 614. He expected exhaustion, relief, maybe tears from Vanessa after the longest week of her life. Instead, through the half-open door, he saw Vanessa laughing softly beside a tall man in a tailored navy suit. The man's silver Rolex flashed beneath hospital lights as he rested one hand comfortably against the small of her back. Not cautiously, not politely, comfortably, like he already belonged there. Damien stopped walking, and for the first time since selling the Mustang, something cold finally moved through his chest. Damien stood outside room 614 for 3 full seconds, before pushing the door open the rest of the way. The hospital door moved silently on hydraulic hinges. Vanessa turned first. For half a second, surprise crossed her face. Real surprise, as if she genuinely had not expected him to come. Then it disappeared. Her expression reorganized itself quickly. Calm, controlled, corporate. The same face she used during networking dinners when she needed investors to trust her. Damien, she said softly. The man beside her turned next. Tall, early 40s. Expensive haircut. The kind that needed maintenance every 8 days to keep looking effortless. Navy Tom Ford suit. White pocket square. Polished black loafers that had never touched motor oil or concrete dust. His Rolex Submariner caught the fluorescent light when he extended his hand. Brandon Pierce. His smile came practiced and smooth. I've heard a lot about you. Damien looked at the hand for a moment before shaking it once. Brandon's grip tried slightly too hard. Men like Brandon always believed pressure meant dominance. Damien released first. Inside the room, Walter Carter lay propped against white hospital pillows with tubes running beneath the blanket and an oxygen line beneath his nose. His skin looked gray under the overhead lights, smaller somehow, weaker. A heart monitor blinked steadily beside the bed. 72 again. Walter's eyes shifted toward Damien, and something softened there immediately. Kid, he rasped. Damien walked closer. You made it. Walter tried to smile but winced halfway through. Doctor says that's a good sign, Damien said quietly. Walter let out a rough breath that almost sounded like a laugh. Vanessa stepped between them slightly. Dad needs to keep stress low. The sentence landed strangely. Not rude. Not warm either. Just carefully managed. Brandon slipped one hand into his pocket and glanced around the room like he belonged there already. Walter gave us a scare, he said. But Riverside has an excellent cardiac team. Damien nodded once. His eyes moved briefly toward Vanessa's left hand. No engagement ring. The pale line where it usually rested was still visible beneath the hospital lighting. Vanessa noticed him looking. She folded her arms immediately afterward. A nurse entered carrying medication cups and paused when she saw the room crowded. Only family for another few minutes, please. Brandon smiled politely. Of course. But he didn't move. The nurse looked uncertain for a second before adjusting Walter's IV and leaving quietly. Damien noticed things like that, people revealing hierarchy without words. Walter shifted painfully against the bed. You eat today? He asked Damien. Vanessa looked irritated instantly. Dad, seriously? What? Walter muttered weakly. Boy forgets meals when he works. Damien almost answered automatically the way he had for years. Instead, Brandon spoke first. Vanessa told me you own the garage downtown. Damien turned toward him. East 5th, right. Brandon smiled again. Restoration work, correct? Mostly. That's a dying business these days. Silence settled for one beat too long. Vanessa reached for a plastic water cup on the counter. Brandon works in private investment, she said quickly. He's been helping us navigate some financial issues. Helping us? Damien heard the wording carefully. Not helping Walter. Helping us. Walter looked toward the ceiling instead of anyone in the room. His fingers twitched faintly against the blanket. Damien knew that movement too. Walter Carter only did that when uncomfortable conversations started happening around him. Brandon stepped closer to the hospital bed. Carter Medical Supply has a lot of potential with the right restructuring. Vanessa nodded immediately. Exactly. Damien stayed still. He suddenly remembered a dinner 6 months earlier at Jeff Ruby's steakhouse downtown. Walter had complained quietly over bourbon that banks were tightening pressure on the company's operating loans, supply chain costs, late hospital reimbursements, shrinking margins. Walter built Carter Medical Supply over 30 years delivering equipment to regional hospitals across Ohio. Surgical carts, rehab equipment, disposable supplies. Steady business once. Not anymore. Damien remembered offering help back then. Walter refused. Family handles family problems, he'd said. Now Brandon Pierce stood in the recovery room talking about restructuring while Walter still had surgical tape on his chest. Interesting timing. Vanessa moved toward Damien finally. Can I talk to you outside for a second? Her voice lowered carefully. Controlled again. Damien glanced once toward Walter. The older man looked exhausted already. Sure. The hallway outside room 614 smelled like disinfectant and burnt coffee from the nurse's station. Rain tapped softly against distant windows. Vanessa closed the door halfway behind them. For a second, neither spoke. Then she crossed her arms tightly. You should have called before coming. Damien stared at her. You said your father asked about me. That's not what I mean. He waited. Vanessa exhaled slowly through her nose. Things are complicated right now. Complicated. Yes. Her tone sharpened slightly now, frustration leaking through the calm surface. Dad's surgery created a lot of pressure financially and emotionally, and Brandon has been helping us through all of it. Damien looked at her for several quiet seconds. He noticed tiny details when upset. The expensive cream coat she wore, fresh manicure despite sleeping at the hospital, the diamond earrings he had never seen before, and the absence of the ring he bought her 2 years earlier at a jewelry store near Dublin Road after saving money for 11 months. When were you planning to tell me, he asked. Vanessa looked away first. That's not fair. No, you're making this sound worse than it is. What is it? Silence. A nurse pushed a medication cart past them. Somewhere farther down the corridor, an elderly woman started crying softly behind another closed door. Vanessa lowered her voice again. Brandon and I met during the hospital situation. Damien said nothing. He's been helping with investors and legal strategy for the company. Legal strategy. Damien, her shoulders tightened. We've been growing apart for a while. That sentence finally landed. Not because it was loud, because it sounded rehearsed, like something practiced privately before delivery. Damien leaned back against the wall beside the room. 3 nights earlier, she had cried on the phone, asking for help to save her father's life. 2 nights earlier, she texted him updates during surgery. Yesterday morning, she still wore his ring. And now there was Brandon Pierce, already standing beside Walter's hospital bed like a replacement piece slid neatly into position. How long? Damien asked. Vanessa rubbed one temple. I don't want to do this here. How long? Another pause. Then a few weeks. The answer felt clinically incomplete. Not shocking, just incomplete. The recovery room door opened behind them before Damien could respond. Brandon stepped into the hallway holding Walter's chart folder casually in one hand. Walter's asking for you, he told Vanessa. Then he looked toward Damien. And seriously, man, glad everything worked out financially. There it was. Not an accident, not gratitude either, a subtle positioning statement, as if Brandon already believed he understood the hierarchy here. Vanessa shot Brandon a quick look. Too late. Damien had already heard it, financially, meaning she told him. About the money, about the surgery, maybe even about the Mustang. Brandon offered another polished smile. We all appreciate people stepping up during difficult times. People, not you. People. Damien looked at the folder in Brandon's hand. Hospital paperwork, insurance forms, maybe company documents mixed inside already. He noticed Walter watching silently through the small opening in the doorway. The old man's eyes looked uneasy now, tired, aware. Damien suddenly understood something important. Walter didn't fully know what was happening around him yet, but Brandon Pierce was moving fast, very fast, and men who moved that fast around sick people usually wanted signatures before recovery. Damien straightened slowly. I should head back to the garage, he said. Vanessa looked relieved immediately. That hurt more than anger would have. Brandon nodded once. Take care, Damien. Damien ignored the hand Brandon almost offered again. Instead, he looked past both of them toward Walter. I'm glad you made it through surgery. Walter held his gaze. So am I, the older man whispered. Damien turned and walked down the hallway without rushing. Rubber soles squeaked across polished hospital floors behind him. Monitors beeped steadily in distant rooms. Outside, cold rain covered Columbus in gray reflections. And somewhere between the elevator and the parking garage, Damien realized he no longer felt heartbreak first. He felt caution. Ket Thuk Fan rain hammered the windshield hard enough to blur the parking garage lights into streaks of white and yellow. Damien sat inside the old Ford F-150 with both hands resting loosely on the steering wheel. The engine was off, wipers motionless. Water slid slowly across cracked glass while hospital elevators carried families up and down behind him. He didn't drive away immediately. Most men would have. Some would have stormed back upstairs. Others would have called Vanessa 10 times before reaching the highway. Damien did none of that. He simply sat still and replayed details. Brandon holding Walter's medical folder. Vanessa removing the engagement ring before Damien arrived. The phrase helping us. And the speed. That was the part bothering him most. Not the betrayal itself. The speed of replacement. People rarely shifted emotionally that fast, unless the transition had started long before the official ending. Damien reached into the center console and pulled out his phone. 3 unread messages waited there already. The first came from the hospital billing department. Payment confirmation. Riverside Methodist Hospital. Amount received $86,417.23. Damien stared at the number for several seconds. That amount had once been an engine. Road trips. His father's laugh. Saturday mornings rebuilding carburetors together. Now it existed as a transaction ID. He opened the second message. Vanessa, please don't turn this ugly. Nothing else. No explanation. No apology. Just management. Like she was already anticipating fallout and trying to control damage before it spread. Damien leaned back slowly against the worn seat. His father used to say something during difficult negotiations at the garage. The first person trying to calm things down usually knows exactly how bad they behaved. Damien opened the third message. Unknown number. Hey man, Brandon here. Appreciate your support during Walter's recovery. Family means stepping up when it matters. No emoji. No signature. The message felt polished enough to belong in a corporate handbook. Damien read it twice, then locked the screen without replying. The rain outside intensified. Across the garage, a young couple argued quietly beside a silver Honda Accord while unloading overnight bags. Somewhere above, an ambulance siren approached Riverside's emergency entrance. Life continuing normally, as if nothing had changed. But Damien understood something important now. This situation had already moved beyond heartbreak. There were financial conversations happening underneath it, and financial conversations always left paperwork. That thought settled his breathing almost immediately, not emotionally, practically. Damien started the truck. The engine coughed once before catching. 22 minutes later, he pulled into Simmons Auto and Restoration under cold rain and flickering streetlights. The garage looked emptier without the Mustang. Not visually, spiritually. Damien unlocked the office door and switched on the lamp above his father's old metal desk. The same desk Frank Simmons bought from a police auction in 1998. Heavy gray steel. One drawer permanently jammed halfway open. Another filled with 30 years of receipts organized by date. Frank kept records for everything. Every oil filter, every customer invoice, every payroll stub. Documents outlive emotions, Frank always said. Damien sat down slowly and opened his laptop. Then he began organizing. Hospital transfer receipt, wire confirmation, screenshots of Vanessa's calls, text messages asking for help, insurance emails, timeline. Nothing dramatic, nothing obsessive, just order. By midnight, a yellow legal pad beside the keyboard contained 4 pages of handwritten notes, dates, times, conversations, observations. At 12:41 a.m., Damien finally stopped typing and stared across the dark garage floor. The empty Mustang space remained visible through the office glass. His chest tightened briefly. Not from regret over the money. He would have saved Walter again if given the choice. That part still felt right. Walter had always treated him fairly. The older man never mocked the garage, never looked embarrassed by Damien's hands or clothes or work boots at family dinners. Walter respected labor. Vanessa respected outcomes. There was a difference. Damien rubbed both hands across his face and reached for his phone again. Then he scrolled to a number he hadn't called in almost 11 months. Evelyn Brooks, partner at Brooks & Tate Legal Group, commercial litigation specialist. 58 years old, razor-sharp memory, smoked expensive cigarettes despite repeatedly claiming she planned to quit. She and Frank Simmons had once dated briefly sometime in the late 90s before deciding they worked better as friends. Evelyn answered on the third ring. You know it's after midnight, right? You're awake. Insomnia doesn't mean available. Damien almost smiled slightly at that. You busy tomorrow? A pause. Depends how expensive the problem is. Damien looked toward the payment receipt on his desk. Potentially very. Silence settled briefly on the line. Evelyn knew Damien well enough to recognize the tone immediately. What happened, Damien explained everything carefully. No exaggeration. No emotional speeches, just facts. Walter's surgery, the payment, Brandon Pierce, the recovery room, the company discussions, the engagement ring gone. Evelyn interrupted only twice, once to ask Brandon's full name, another time to ask exactly when Vanessa first mentioned investors. When Damien finished, Evelyn stayed quiet for nearly 10 seconds. That man moved into the picture fast, she finally said. Exactly. You think this is about the company? I think it's about timing, and timing usually means money. Damien leaned back in the chair. I'm not looking to sue anyone. Good. Lawsuits driven by emotion are expensive entertainment. I just want clarity. Evelyn laughed softly. No, Damien. You want information. Smart people always say clarity when they mean leverage. Damien didn't answer, because she wasn't entirely wrong. Evelyn's keyboard clicked faintly through the phone. I know the name Brandon Pierce, she said after a moment. That got Damien's attention immediately. You do private capital consultant, some restructuring work in Indiana. Couple aggressive acquisitions. Nothing criminal that I remember. But there's always a but when lawyers talk. Damien waited. I remember one dispute involving elderly ownership transfer allegations around a logistics company outside Indianapolis. The office suddenly felt colder. What kind of allegations? Pressure tactics. Signatures during medical recovery. Claims of manipulated debt exposure. Damien stared at the rain outside the garage windows. Exactly. Not proof yet. But exactly. Evelyn continued. I'll look deeper tomorrow. I'm not asking you to start a war. No. Her voice sharpened slightly. You're asking me whether someone is trying to quietly position himself around a weakened family business while the owner is recovering from heart surgery. When she phrased it that way, the entire situation sounded uglier than Damien wanted to admit. And I think you were useful until the money arrived. That line landed harder than anything else that night, not because Damien hadn't considered it, because hearing it out loud made it real. He looked again at the hospital receipt. $86,417.23. His father's Mustang reduced to digits on a bank transfer. Evelyn spoke again. Did Walter know where the surgery money came from? Yes. And Brandon? I think Vanessa told him. Of course she did. The lawyer sighed quietly. Listen carefully, Damien. From now on, you document everything. Save every message, every voicemail, every timestamp. I already started. I figured. Another pause. Then, do not confront Brandon emotionally. I wasn't planning to. Good. Men like that understand anger. They prepare for it. Calm people scare them more. Damien looked around the office slowly. Old desk, coffee rings. Tools hanging neatly against the wall. His father's framed military photograph above the filing cabinet. Quiet things. Stable things. I'll come by the garage tomorrow morning, Evelyn said. 8:30. Thanks. Don't thank me yet. She paused before adding one last sentence. And Damien. Yeah. If Brandon Pierce is moving this quickly around Carter Medical Supply, then I promise you this isn't just relationship drama anymore. The call ended. Damien sat alone in silence afterward. Rain tapped steadily against the garage roof. Somewhere in the dark beyond the office glass, the empty Mustang space waited quietly beneath fluorescent lights. And for the first time since leaving Riverside Hospital, Damien stopped feeling blindsided. Now he felt alert. Evelyn Brooks arrived at Simmons Auto and Restoration at exactly 8:27 the next morning. 3 minutes early. That was normal for her. A black Audi A6 pulled beside the garage entrance, while Damien was replacing brake lines on a silver Tacoma. Evelyn stepped out wearing a charcoal coat, dark sunglasses, and heels completely unsuited for a repair shop floor. She looked around once. Still smells like bad financial decisions in here. Damien slid out from beneath the truck. Good morning to you too. Evelyn removed the sunglasses, sharp gray eyes. No wasted movement. She carried two things in one hand, a leather portfolio, and a paper coffee cup from Staff's. Medium roast, she said, setting the coffee on Damien's toolbox. You still drink it like motor oil? Probably. That's comforting. Damien wiped his hands clean while Evelyn walked slowly through the garage. Her eyes paused briefly at the empty corner space. The Mustang's gone. Yesterday? You regret it? No. The answer came instantly. That interested her. Evelyn nodded once. Good. Regret clouds memory. She moved toward the office. Let's talk. The office behind the garage looked cleaner than most law firms. Damien kept paperwork stacked by date invoices, alphabetized tools, aligned exactly where they belonged. Frank Simmons' habits again. Evelyn noticed the yellow legal pad immediately. Timeline. Damien handed it over. She read quietly for almost 2 minutes while Damien stood beside the filing cabinet drinking coffee. Outside, impact guns echoed across the garage floor. Traffic moved slowly down East Fifth Avenue. Normal morning, unusual conversation. Finally, Evelyn closed the notebook. You documented better than half my clients already. My father liked records. Your father distrusted people. Smart man. She opened her portfolio and spread several printed documents across the desk. Corporate filings, LLC registrations, business restructuring notices. Damien leaned closer. Brandon Pierce owns Pierce Strategic Capital, Evelyn explained. Officially headquartered in Indianapolis. Small private equity operation. Legitimate? Technically. That word mattered. Technically, legitimate businesses still ruin people every day. Evelyn tapped another document. 2 dissolved subsidiaries in Illinois. 1 acquisition dispute in Indiana. 1 civil complaint involving elder financial coercion. Damien's jaw tightened slightly. What happened? Case settled privately. No admission of wrongdoing. But settlement agreements usually mean someone wanted silence. Evelyn folded her arms. The timing bothers me most. Damien looked toward the rain-streaked office window. It bothered me too. Evelyn nodded. Walter Carter collapses. Company unstable. Emergency surgery. Emotional family chaos. Suddenly Brandon Pierce appears offering financial rescue. She tapped the papers again. That's not random. Damien sat down slowly. For years he had known Carter Medical Supply only from the edges. Walter occasionally complained about supplier delays over dinner. Vanessa vented about staffing issues and hospital contracts, but Damien never inserted himself deeply into the business. Not his place. Still, he knew enough. Carter Medical Supply operated out of a warehouse near Dublin Road with around 40 employees. Mid-sized regional medical distribution company. Hospital rehab equipment. Mobility devices. Emergency restocking contracts. Not glamorous, but valuable. Especially to investors looking for distressed businesses with existing infrastructure. Evelyn opened another file. I pulled preliminary UCC filings this morning. Damien looked up. There's already movement against company assets. How recent? Very. She slid the paper across the desk. Filed 2 days earlier, same day as Walter's surgery. Damien stared at the date quietly. Brandon had started positioning legal claims while Walter lay unconscious in cardiac recovery. Cold, efficient, calculated. What kind of claim, Damien asked? Preliminary debt leverage agreement attached to anticipated restructuring capital. Meaning Brandon is trying to establish himself as a secured creditor before the company stabilizes. Damien leaned back slowly. And if Walter signs anything while recovering, Evelyn met his eyes directly. Then Brandon gains leverage over ownership percentages, repayment structure, possibly operational authority. Outside the office, a customer laughed loudly while discussing transmission problems with another mechanic. The sound felt strangely distant. Damien rubbed one hand across his jaw. Walter wouldn't knowingly hand his company away. No, Evelyn agreed, but sick people sign things every day when frightened families tell them it's necessary. That sentence stayed in the room for several seconds. Damien thought back to Brandon holding Walter's chart folder in the hospital room. Too comfortable. Too involved already. Evelyn continued flipping through documents. Tell me about Vanessa. Damien stayed quiet for a moment. What about her? She grew up privileged upper middle class. Always, mostly. He leaned forward slightly. Walter built the company from nothing. Vanessa didn't grow up rich. But once the contracts expanded around 2010, money changed things. How Damien thought carefully before answering. Expectations. Evelyn nodded slowly. There it is. Damien stared down at the coffee cup. Walter respected work. Vanessa respected appearances. That difference destroys more relationships than infidelity, Evelyn said flatly. She stood and walked toward the office window overlooking the garage. Your truck. Your clothes. The garage. People like Vanessa eventually start seeing those things as reflections of themselves. Damien didn't argue, because part of him had noticed the change already. Not overnight, gradually. First came comments during dinners. Maybe wear a blazer tonight. Maybe don't mention the garage clients. Maybe let Brandon handle the investor conversation. Small things. Then larger ones. Vanessa stopped bringing coworkers around Simmons Auto and Restoration. Stopped wearing the engagement ring consistently during work conferences. Started talking more about future lifestyle and less about marriage. Damien saw it happening. He just believed loyalty mattered more than status anxiety. Maybe Walter believed that too. Evelyn interrupted his thoughts. You ever financially support Carter Medical Supply before this? A few times? How repairs? Mostly. Delayed invoices, loaned equipment, documented. Some. Evelyn pointed at him immediately. Find everything. Damien frowned. It wasn't formal. Doesn't matter. She walked back toward the desk. Men like Brandon rewrite narratives fast. If this turns ugly suddenly, you become the unstable ex-boyfriend trying to sabotage a successful investor. Damien almost smiled faintly. Already happening. Oh. He grabbed his phone and opened Instagram. Vanessa had posted 2 hours earlier. A photo from Riverside Hospital. Walter asleep in the background. Vanessa standing beside Brandon in the foreground. Caption: Grateful for the people who truly step up during life's hardest moments. Brandon's hand rested visibly on her shoulder. Hundreds of likes already. Evelyn stared at the screen, then laughed once without humor. There it is. Damien locked the phone again. She moves fast too. No, Evelyn corrected quietly. She adapts fast. That distinction mattered. One implied impulsiveness, the other implied choice. A knock sounded at the office door. Nathan Damien's part-time mechanic leaned inside holding a parts invoice. Mid-20s, oil-stained hoodie, constant chewing gum. Sorry, Nathan said. Customer asking if the charger's done by Friday. Damien answered automatically. Saturday morning. Nathan nodded but hesitated. His eyes shifted briefly between Damien and Evelyn. You okay, boss? Fine. Nathan accepted that immediately and disappeared back into the garage. Evelyn watched the exchange. Your people trust you because I pay them. No, she said, because you stay steady. Silence again. Then Evelyn sat back down. Here's my concern. Damien listened. If Brandon is moving for control this aggressively, he's going to need signatures, access, and emotional dependency. Meaning Vanessa. Meaning Vanessa becomes useful if she helps pressure Walter. Damien's expression hardened slightly for the first time all morning. Not anger. Recognition. He remembered how quickly Vanessa redirected conversations yesterday whenever Walter tried speaking directly to him, how Brandon answered questions for the family, how hospital staff already treated Brandon like authorized management. Too fast. Everything too fast. Evelyn closed the folder. For now, we watch. No confrontation, absolutely not. She pointed toward the desk. You keep documenting every message, every timeline detail, every financial interaction. And Brandon. We let him get comfortable. Damien looked toward the garage floor again. His father used to say impatient men destroyed good evidence. Evelyn stood and gathered her papers. One more thing. What if Walter didn't know where the surgery money truly came from? Eventually, he will. Damien said nothing. And when that happens, Evelyn continued the emotional balance inside that family changes completely. She headed toward the office door, then paused. By the way, Damien looked up. I checked public property filings before coming here, and Brandon Pierce recently liquidated 2 commercial assets. Damien frowned slightly. Why, Evelyn's expression turned thoughtful. Either he's raising capital quickly, she opened the office door halfway, or he's running out of it. The garage noises swallowed her footsteps as she walked outside. Damien remained seated alone at the desk. The empty Mustang space sat motionless beyond the office glass. And somewhere deep beneath the betrayal, beneath the heartbreak, beneath the humiliation of that hospital room, a different realization finally settled into place. Brandon Pierce needed something urgently, and desperate men always made mistakes eventually. Vanessa texted Damien at 4:18 Thursday afternoon. Can we meet tonight? Please act like adults about this. No apology, no explanation, just negotiation language again. Damien stared at the message while tightening bolts on the Nova's suspension assembly. Grease darkened the lines in his knuckles. The garage radio played low classic rock near the service bay while rainwater dripped steadily outside. Nathan looked over from the tire machine. You good, boss? Yeah. Nathan nodded and went back to work. Damien wiped his hands clean, then typed one reply. Where? The answer came immediately. The Guild House, 7 o'clock. Of course, not a diner. Not somewhere private. Somewhere expensive enough to establish tone before conversation even started. The Guild House sat in the short North District beneath soft amber lighting and polished glass walls. The kind of restaurant where men discussed acquisitions over bourbon and women wore perfume that cost more than monthly truck payments. Damien arrived at 6:56 wearing dark jeans, clean boots, and the only charcoal button-up shirt he owned without oil stains. The hostess smiled politely while scanning reservations. Table for Carter. Not Simmons. Carter. Another detail. She led him past candlelit tables and quiet conversations toward the rear dining section where Vanessa already sat beside Brandon Pierce beneath a hanging chandelier. Brandon stood first. Confident smile. Tailored gray jacket tonight. Gold cufflinks. Every movement calibrated for visibility. Damien Brandon said warmly, "Glad you came." Vanessa remained seated. A glass of white wine rested beside her untouched salad. "You look tired," she said. Damien pulled out the chair across from them. "So do you." A waiter appeared almost instantly. Sparkling water already on the table. Reservation planned carefully. "Can I start you with a drinks or coffee?" The waiter blinked once. "At dinner, black." Brandon smiled politely again after the waiter left. "I respect consistency." Damien ignored that. For a moment, nobody spoke. Silverware clinked softly around them while muted jazz drifted through hidden ceiling speakers. The restaurant smelled faintly of rosemary butter and expensive wine. Vanessa folded her hands together on the table. "I wanted us to clear the air." Damien looked at her quietly. "Go ahead." She exhaled slowly. What happened at the hospital wasn't ideal. Interesting wording again. Not wrong, not hurtful, not betrayal, not ideal. Damien leaned back slightly. "You mean introducing your new partner beside your father's hospital bed after I paid for his surgery?" Brandon stepped in smoothly before Vanessa answered. "Let's keep emotions reasonable here." Damien turned toward him. "You should probably avoid the phrase reasonable when discussing someone else's fiancé." That landed. Brandon's smile tightened for less than half a second before recovering. Vanessa rubbed her temple. "This is exactly what I didn't want." "No?" Damien said calmly. "You wanted this managed quietly." Her eyes flashed briefly. "There's no reason to make things ugly." Damien noticed that word again. Ugly. Not unfair, not dishonest, just inconvenient. The waiter returned with Damien's coffee, white porcelain cup, steam curling upward beneath soft restaurant lighting. Brandon waited until the waiter disappeared before speaking again. "Look, Damien, Vanessa and I didn't plan this situation, but you adapted quickly." Vanessa looked away immediately. Another tiny detail. Brandon rested both forearms casually on the table. People grow apart, usually before replacement plans move into hospital rooms. Vanessa's jaw tightened. "We were already having problems." Damien stirred the coffee once without drinking it. "What problems?" Silence. Finally, Vanessa answered. "You were comfortable staying exactly where you are forever." "There it is," Damien said softly. She frowned slightly. "What but the real conversation?" Vanessa straightened in her chair. "You own a garage, Damien. I'm aware. You work 70 hours a week and still live behind the shop half the time. That garage paid for your father's surgery." The sentence landed hard enough to silence the table briefly. Brandon stepped in again. And that was generous. Damien finally looked directly at him. "What exactly do you do, Brandon?" The question came so calmly it almost sounded polite. Brandon smiled carefully. "Private investment consulting. For who? Various clients." Doing what Vanessa sighed sharply. "This isn't an interrogation." Damien kept his eyes on Brandon. "Humor me." Brandon lifted his wine glass slowly. "Business restructuring, asset recovery, growth positioning, corporate language, smooth and vague." Damien nodded once. "You buy struggling companies." "I stabilize them." "By taking ownership." Brandon's smile returned again. "Ownership follows risk." There it was. Finally, something honest. Damien took his first sip of coffee. Still hot, still bitter, very steady. Vanessa crossed one leg over the other. "Carter Medical Supply needs help right now." Damien looked at her. "And Brandon's helping." "Yes." "At what price?" "That's none of your business anymore." The sentence came colder than the others. Not emotional. Final. Damien studied her face quietly. He remembered late nights eating takeout on the garage roof together during summer storms, remembered helping her study for marketing certifications, remembered Walter joking that Damien already acted more like family than most relatives. Now Vanessa sat beneath restaurant lighting beside another man talking like lawyers handled emotions better than honesty. Interesting how quickly intimacy turned corporate. Brandon leaned slightly forward. Damien, I understand this is difficult personally. No, Damien corrected softly. You don't. A long silence followed. Nearby a server laughed at another table. Wine glasses touched somewhere behind them. The world continued normally while three people quietly negotiated the remains of a relationship. Vanessa lowered her voice. We can pay you back. Damien almost smiled, not because it was funny, because it revealed everything. Not we owe you. Not I'm sorry. Just transaction management again. How he asked. We'll work something out. With investor money. Her expression hardened. You're being petty. No, Damien said. I'm asking practical questions. Brandon folded his napkin carefully beside the plate. You seem very interested in company finances for someone outside the business. Damien noticed that wording too. Outside the business. Territory language? Claim staking. Walter asked me for advice years before you arrived, Damien said. Brandon nodded casually. And now professionals are involved. That one was intentional. Vanessa looked uncomfortable immediately after he said it. Good, because Damien finally understood Brandon's strategy clearly. Humiliation, subtle dominance, established class difference, garage owner versus investor, blue collar versus capital. People like Brandon always assumed quiet men felt inferior automatically. Damien rested both hands calmly around the coffee cup. What bank handles your restructuring capital? He asked suddenly. Brandon blinked once. Unexpected question. Excuse me, your funding line. Who underwrites it? Vanessa frowned. Damien. No, I'm curious now. Brandon leaned back carefully. Why? Because distressed acquisition lending tightened after fourth quarter regional defaults, meaning either your rates are terrible. Damien paused briefly. Or somebody's extending you unsecured confidence they probably shouldn't. Vanessa stared at him. So did Brandon. The silence changed shape instantly. For the first time all evening, Brandon looked slightly uncertain. Tiny shift. Barely visible. But Damien saw it. Interesting observation, Brandon said carefully. Damien shrugged once. My customers talk while I work. That was partly true. People underestimated mechanics constantly. They talked freely around men holding tools. Bankers, dealers, business owners, lawyers. Information traveled through garages more often than country clubs. Brandon recovered his smile again, but it arrived slower now. You're sharper than Vanessa described. Damien looked toward Vanessa. What exactly did you describe? She looked embarrassed for the first time all night. That answered enough. The waiter returned asking about dinner orders. Nobody answered immediately. Finally, Brandon ordered filet mignon. Vanessa ordered salmon. Damien closed the menu. Just coffee. After the waiter left, Vanessa spoke quietly. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Damien stood slowly from the table. No, he said. I think I'm finally understanding it exactly the way it is. Vanessa looked up sharply. What does that mean? Damien reached into his jacket pocket and placed a small velvet box gently beside her wine glass. Her engagement ring, the one she had stopped wearing before the hospital. Brandon's eyes moved immediately toward it. Vanessa froze. You left it in the apartment drawer, Damien said. The restaurant noise around them suddenly felt very far away. I figured you'd want it back before things got legally complicated. Vanessa's face paled slightly. Damien, you should also tell Walter exactly where the surgery money came from. Brandon's expression changed again. Quickly this time. Concern. Real concern. Interesting. Damien noticed that too. Then Vanessa said the sentence that finally settled everything permanently. You were never really part of the future, Damien. No anger, no tears, just honesty stripped clean at last. Damien looked at her for several quiet seconds. Then he nodded once and walked away from the table without touching the coffee again. Behind him, Brandon said something low to Vanessa immediately. Too fast, too nervous. And for the first time since Riverside Hospital, Damien became certain of one thing. Brandon Pierce was afraid of something. Damien did not call Vanessa after the dinner at the Guild House. He did not post quotes online, did not drink himself unconscious, did not ask mutual friends for explanations. By Monday morning, Simmons Auto and Restoration opened at 6:15 exactly like always. The fluorescent lights hummed awake. Coffee brewed in the stained machine beside the office sink. Impact wrenches echoed across the concrete floor. And Damien Simmons rebuilt a 1972 Chevelle transmission with the same steady hands he used before his engagement collapsed. That unsettled people more than anger would have. Nathan noticed it first. "You sure you're good?" he asked while carrying brake rotors across the garage. Damien looked up briefly from the transmission housing. "Why does everybody keep asking me that?" "Because most guys don't get cheated on by rich finance dudes and come to work acting normal." Damien tightened a bolt carefully. "Most guys break things they can't replace." Nathan stared at him for a second, then quietly nodded and went back to work. Around noon, Evelyn Brooks arrived again, this time carrying a cardboard archive box instead of coffee. "Tell me you found something useful," Damien said. Evelyn placed the box on the office desk. "I found several things concerning enough to ruin my weekend." That was promising. Damien closed the office door while Evelyn unpacked folders methodically. Public filings, lawsuit records, corporate registrations, photocopies marked with yellow tabs. She removed her glasses and looked directly at him. "Brandon Pierce is smarter than I hoped and dirtier than I expected." Damien leaned against the filing cabinet. "What happened in Indiana?" "Officially nothing." Unofficially, Evelyn slid over a deposition transcript. "Family-owned freight company outside Indianapolis. Owner had a stroke. Brandon entered as restructuring consultant during recovery." Damien already disliked where this sounded headed. Then debt leverage agreements appeared within 14 days. Ownership percentages shifted. Emergency financing attached to operational authority clauses, meaning Brandon gained control, meaning Brandon almost gained control. Damien frowned. What stopped him? The owner's daughter hired litigation counsel before signatures finalized. Evelyn tapped the transcript. The case settled privately. Damien read quietly for several moments. Certain phrases stood out immediately. Medication confusion, hospital pressure, temporary incapacity concerns, financial coercion allegations. Too similar. Way too similar. "He's done this before," Damien said. Evelyn nodded once. "Yes, but carefully enough to avoid criminal exposure." Outside the office, Nathan laughed at something playing on the radio. Air compressors hissed, metal clanged against concrete. Ordinary sounds. Meanwhile, inside the office, a pattern was forming quietly. Evelyn pulled another folder from the box. "This part interests me more." She handed Damien a financial summary sheet. Pierce Strategic Capital, recent asset liquidation activity, commercial property sold in Indianapolis, luxury condo refinanced, investment account withdrawals, large outgoing transfers. Damien studied the dates. All within the last 4 months. "He's raising money fast," Damien said. "Or covering losses fast." Difference, desperation. Evelyn sat down heavily in Frank Simmons' old chair. Men like Brandon don't chase unstable regional supply companies unless they need something immediately. Damien crossed his arms. "Walter's company isn't big enough for national attention." "Exactly," Evelyn pointed toward him. "So either Brandon sees hidden value?" She paused. "Or he needs quick collateral access before somebody else closes a door on him." Damien thought about the dinner again. The forced confidence, the polished smiles, and especially the moment Brandon reacted when Damien mentioned lending structures. Fear. Very brief, but real. Evelyn continued. "I also contacted someone quietly inside Ohio corporate banking." Damien looked up. "You still have those contacts?" "I'm a 60-year-old litigation attorney, Damien. My contacts are the only reason anyone tolerates me." That almost earned a smile. Almost. She slid another paper across the desk. Carter Medical Supply current debt exposure estimates. Numbers highlighted in red. Damien scanned silently. Outstanding supplier liabilities. Equipment financing pressure. Delayed hospital reimbursements. Operational payroll concerns. The company was bleeding cash faster than Walter likely admitted publicly. Vanessa know how bad this is, Damien asked. She probably knows enough to panic, and Brandon knows enough to exploit it. Evelyn nodded slowly. That's my assumption. Silence settled briefly. Then Damien asked the question bothering him most. Why involve Vanessa personally? Evelyn leaned back in the chair. Because emotionally compromised families cooperate faster. The sentence landed heavily. Walter trusts his daughter. Vanessa trusts Brandon. Brandon gains influence through emotional proximity. She folded her hands calmly. None of this works unless the family accepts him quickly. Damien looked toward the garage through the office window. He suddenly remembered how naturally Brandon moved around the hospital room. How he spoke for Vanessa. Held Walter's paperwork. Positioned himself physically between conversations. Not arrogance. Strategy. Evelyn interrupted his thoughts. You still have access to Walter directly. Maybe. Good. But I'm not manipulating him. I didn't say manipulate. She leaned forward slightly. I said communicate. Damien remained quiet, because despite everything, part of him still resisted turning this into war. Walter had just survived heart surgery. The old man did not deserve battlefield stress while recovering. Evelyn seemed to understand that immediately. You don't have to destroy anyone, she said. You just need facts positioned correctly. Facts positioned correctly. That sounded exactly like Frank Simmons. At 2:13 p.m., Damien's phone buzzed across the desk. Vanessa. He stared at the screen without answering. Evelyn noticed. Speaker. Damien accepted the call. Vanessa's voice came sharp and immediate. What exactly did you say to Brandon about what he thinks you're investigating him? Interesting. Not, are you okay? Not, can we talk straight to Brandon? Damien looked toward Evelyn calmly. Should he be worried? A long pause answered louder than words. Damien Vanessa said carefully, You need to stop escalating this. I'm repairing transmissions. Don't do that. Do what act innocent. Evelyn wrote something down quietly while listening. Vanessa continued, Brandon is trying to help stabilize my father's company. By moving debt leverage agreements during post-surgery recovery, silence. Then, you've been talking to lawyers. There it was, fear again, smaller than Brandon's, but growing. Damien kept his tone even. I've been organizing paperwork. You're making this harder than it has to be. That phrase keeps coming up. Because you won't let this go. Damien finally straightened from the filing cabinet. You called me crying at 1 a.m, asking to save your father's life. Vanessa went quiet. You knew exactly what that money cost me. Still silence. You stood beside another man 3 days later and introduced me like I delivered flowers. Evelyn stopped writing. The garage noises outside suddenly seemed very far away. Finally, Vanessa spoke again, softer this time. That wasn't fair. No, Damien agreed quietly. It wasn't. The line remained silent for several seconds. Then Vanessa changed direction completely. Dad wants to see you. Damien's eyes narrowed slightly. When tomorrow afternoon? Why? He asked questions about the surgery payment. There it was, the truth finally moving toward Walter. Vanessa continued quickly. I didn't tell him about the Mustang, meaning she told him everything else. Damien rubbed one hand slowly across his jaw. Will Brandon be there? Another pause. Yes. Of course. Damien looked at Evelyn again. The attorney gave almost no visible reaction except one tiny nod. Proceed carefully. Fine, Damien said into the phone. I'll stop by. Vanessa exhaled quietly in relief. Thank you. Before she hung up, Damien asked one last question. Vanessa, when exactly did Brandon move in? The silence this time lasted longer, too long. Then, it just happened. Lie. Not because of evidence, because people telling the truth answer faster. The call disconnected. Evelyn removed her glasses slowly. Well, she said. Damien stared at the silent phone screen. She's scared now. Yes, of Brandon partly. Evelyn closed the file folders one at a time. But mostly, she's scared the narrative is slipping away from her. Damien leaned against the desk quietly. Outside, rain clouds gathered again over East Fifth Avenue. Inside the garage, engines roared, tools slammed, radios played. Normal life continuing. But beneath it now sat something sharper. Not heartbreak anymore. Pattern recognition. And patterns always mattered more than promises. Then Evelyn slid one final document across the desk. A scanned copy of a preliminary restructuring agreement draft. Unsigned, but prepared. Damien's eyes stopped immediately at the bottom page. Signature line. Walter Carter, Managing Owner. Below it sat another line. Operational Advisory Authority, Brandon Pierce. And in the corner of the document, printed faintly beside the draft timestamp, was a date. The same night Walter entered cardiac recovery. Riverside Methodist Hospital looked different during daylight. Less dramatic. More clinical. Morning sunlight spilled through the main atrium windows onto polished floors while nurses pushed carts between elevators and exhausted families slept awkwardly in waiting room chairs beneath muted television screens. Damien arrived at 1:40 p.m. wearing a dark work jacket over a gray thermal shirt. Grease still marked the edge of one sleeve despite his attempt to scrub it clean before leaving the garage. He noticed Brandon's black Mercedes S-Class immediately in the visitor parking structure. Front row. Temporary parking pass hanging from the mirror like he already belonged there permanently. Interesting. Damien took the elevator to the cardiac recovery floor without rushing. The hallway smelled faintly of antiseptic and overbrewed coffee again. Same squeaking shoes, same monitor beeps. But something had shifted underneath the surface now. Last time Damien walked these halls feeling blindsided. Today he walked in watching patterns. Room 614's door stood partially open, voices inside. Vanessa first, low, tense, then Brandon, smooth, controlled. Damien slowed before entering. Not the right time for extra stress, Brandon was saying. Walter answered weakly from the bed. I asked questions. You need recovery first, Brandon replied gently. Damien stepped into the room. Conversation stopped immediately. There it was again. That split-second silence people create when they were discussing something they hoped you hadn't heard. Walter looked thinner than before, color still poor beneath fluorescent lighting, but his eyes sharpened slightly when they landed on Damien. Kid. Damien walked closer. How are you feeling? Like somebody parked a truck on my chest. That means you're alive. Walter gave a rough laugh that triggered a cough halfway through. Vanessa adjusted his blanket quickly. You shouldn't talk too much. Walter ignored her. Sit down. Damien pulled a chair closer beside the bed. Brandon remained standing near the window in a navy blazer with both hands resting casually in his pockets. Positioning again. Always positioning. Walter looked between them slowly, then finally asked the question Damien knew was coming. You sold the Mustang. The room went still. Vanessa looked down immediately. Brandon's expression remained neutral but careful now. Damien answered simply. Yes. Walter stared at him for several seconds. That car was your father. Yeah. Why the hell would you do that? Damien glanced briefly toward Vanessa, then back to Walter. You needed surgery. The older man closed his eyes slowly. For a moment, nobody spoke. The heart monitor continued its steady electronic rhythm beside the bed. Walter swallowed hard. You should have told me. Damien's answer came quiet. You were busy trying not to die. Vanessa stepped in quickly. We're going to repay him. Walter opened his eyes again. With what money? No one answered immediately. Interesting. Brandon finally moved away from the window. Walter, right now the focus should be stabilizing both your health and the company. There was that word again. Stabilizing. Corporate language wrapped around emotional vulnerability. Walter looked tired suddenly. Not physically. Mentally. Like pieces around him were moving too fast while he remained trapped in bed, unable to keep pace. Damien saw it clearly now. Brandon filled silence quickly because silence allowed thinking. Walter shifted painfully against the pillows. What exactly are you doing for the company? Brandon? Very small pause, almost invisible. But Damien noticed. Helping restructure debt exposure, Brandon answered smoothly. Short-term liquidity strategy. Walter frowned faintly. You're talking like a bank. Brandon smiled politely. Sometimes businesses survive by acting like one. Walter didn't seem reassured. Vanessa stepped closer to the bed again. Dad, Brandon's helping us avoid bankruptcy. Us again. Not the company, not the employees. Us. Damien stayed quiet, because every additional sentence now revealed more than arguments would. Walter looked toward Damien next. You know anything about this? Another careful moment? Damien could have exposed everything immediately. The unsigned restructuring draft, the Indiana allegations, the suspicious timing. But Evelyn's voice echoed in his memory. Facts positioned correctly. Not emotionally, strategically. So Damien answered carefully. I know the company's under pressure. Walter gave a weak nod. Been rough since winter. Supplier delays, Damien asked. And hospitals paying slower. Walter rubbed one hand weakly across his chest. Payroll alone feels like dragging concrete uphill. Brandon stepped in smoothly again. That's why outside capital matters. Walter looked toward him slowly. And what does outside capital cost? Another excellent question. This time Brandon answered slightly slower. Depends on structure. Damien noticed Vanessa watching Brandon now, instead of her father, waiting for answers. Depending on answers. Interesting dynamic. Walter coughed again before looking back toward Damien. You still got the garage running, okay? Yeah. How many employees now? 3 counting me. Walter nodded thoughtfully. Your father would have been proud. That sentence hit harder than expected. Damien looked away briefly toward the hospital window. Clouds hung low over Columbus outside. Cold gray sky, the same color as the Mustang. Brandon interrupted the moment gently. Walter, we should probably avoid emotionally stressful topics. There it was again, control disguised as concern. Walter's eyes narrowed slightly for the first time since Damien arrived. You my doctor now? Vanessa reacted immediately. Dad. No, Walter muttered. I'm asking. Brandon smiled carefully. Just trying to help your recovery. The older man studied him quietly. Damien saw something shifting then. Small, but important. Doubt. Not complete suspicion yet, but the beginning of it. A knock interrupted the room before anyone spoke again. A nurse entered carrying medications and a tablet device. Mid-30s, blonde hair tied tightly back. Name badge read Emily Harper, R.N. Afternoon, Mr. Carter. Walter gave a tired wave. Emily paused briefly after noticing the crowded room. Need a few minutes for meds and vitals. Brandon immediately stepped aside with polished politeness. Of course. Vanessa moved too. Damien stood from the chair automatically, but before he could leave, Emily glanced at him twice. Recognition. Very brief. Then gone. Interesting. In the hallway outside room 614, Brandon checked something on his phone while Vanessa folded her arms tightly. Neither spoke at first. Damien leaned quietly against the wall near the nurse's station. Finally, Vanessa broke the silence. You didn't need to tell him about the Mustang. Damien looked at her calmly. He asked, You're making him feel guilty. No, Damien replied. Reality is, Vanessa exhaled sharply. You always do this. Do what act morally superior because you sacrifice things. That sentence revealed more than she intended. Not gratitude, resentment. Damien understood suddenly that the Mustang didn't just make her uncomfortable because of guilt. It made Brandon uncomfortable too. Because sacrifice creates contrast, and contrast destroys carefully built narratives. Before Damien could answer, Emily Harper stepped quietly out of the room carrying an empty medication tray. She glanced once toward Brandon, then toward Damien. Mr. Simmons. Brandon's eyes lifted immediately. Damien straightened. Yes? Emily lowered her voice slightly. Can I ask you something? Sure. She hesitated. professional caution visible on her face. When exactly did Mr. Carter sign business paperwork after surgery? The hallway went silent. Vanessa froze. Brandon's expression did not change outwardly, but his shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. Damien noticed. Always the tiny movements. What paperwork? Damien asked carefully. Emily looked uncomfortable now. I'm not supposed to discuss patient matters casually. Brandon stepped forward smoothly. Then you probably shouldn't. Emily met his eyes directly. Interesting. No intimidation there. I asked because I remember visitors bringing documents into the room during restricted recovery hours. Vanessa immediately answered too quickly. Those were insurance forms. Emily stayed silent. That silence said enough. Damien watched Brandon carefully now. The investor smiled politely. Hospital situations become chaotic. I'm sure there's confusion. Emily looked unconvinced. Then she turned back toward Damien. If legal questions come up later, hospital records track medication timing very precisely. There it was. Not an accusation. A warning. Carefully delivered. Brandon's jaw tightened briefly. Vanessa looked pale suddenly. Emily nodded once and walked away toward the nurses' station. No drama. No raised voices. But the atmosphere changed completely after she left, because now someone outside the family had noticed the timing too. Brandon adjusted his watch slowly. People misinterpret things during stressful situations. Damien looked at him calmly. Maybe. Vanessa spoke quickly. This is getting ridiculous. But her voice lacked confidence now. For the first time since Riverside Hospital, Damien saw actual fear entering the room beneath her frustration. Not fear of heartbreak, fear of exposure. Then Brandon slipped one hand into his pocket and smiled again. But this time the smile arrived a little slower, and Damien realized something important. The cracks were starting. By Friday morning, Vanessa Carter had rewritten the story publicly. Not entirely, just enough. Damien discovered it because Nathan walked into the garage holding his phone like it contained something radioactive. You should probably see this. Damien looked up from beneath the hood of a customer's Escalade. Nathan hesitated. Or maybe not. Show me. Nathan handed over the phone reluctantly. Instagram. Vanessa's account. A professionally edited carousel post. First image. Walter Carter smiling weakly from his hospital bed. Second image, Brandon Pierce speaking with doctors in the hallway. Third image, Vanessa leaning against Brandon's shoulder beside a hospital window overlooking downtown Columbus. The caption stretched nearly 4 paragraphs. The hardest moments in life reveal who truly shows up when everything falls apart. Watching someone step forward with strength, leadership, and support during my father's recovery changed the way I see loyalty forever. Below that, some people talk about commitment. Others quietly prove it. No names. That made it smarter. Thousands of people reading it would naturally fill in the blanks themselves. Damien handed the phone back calmly. Nathan blinked. That's it. What did you expect? I don't know. Throwing something, maybe? Damien returned to tightening bolts beneath the hood. Metal clicked steadily against metal. She wants a narrative, he said quietly. Nathan frowned. What does that mean? It means if facts become dangerous later, she'll already have public sympathy positioned first. Nathan stared at him for several seconds. You talk weird after breakups. Damien almost smiled. Then the garage office door opened and Evelyn Brooks entered carrying another stack of documents. Nathan immediately muttered "lawyer lady's back" and disappeared toward the tire bay. Evelyn removed her gloves slowly. You saw the Instagram post. About 20 minutes ago. And Damien shut the Escalade hood carefully. She's establishing optics. Evelyn nodded once. Good. You're thinking correctly. Most people misunderstood social media conflicts. They believed posts existed to express feelings. Evelyn knew better. Public posts established emotional framing before legal realities arrived. Victim positioning, character shaping, audience conditioning. Brandon Pierce understood that game perfectly. The office smelled faintly of printer toner and old coffee when Damien followed Evelyn inside. She dropped a thick folder onto Frank Simmons' desk. I made progress. Damien sat across from her. How bad, potentially excellent. That got his attention. Evelyn opened the folder and spread several photographs across the desk. Hospital hallway, still images, security timestamps. Visitor logs. Damien leaned forward immediately. You got camera access. Not directly, but hospital administration became cooperative after I mentioned concerns involving medicated patient signatures. She tapped one printed frame. Timestamp 11:42 p.m. Brandon Pierce entering Walter's recovery room, carrying a leather portfolio. Another frame. 12:16 a.m. Brandon leaving the room. Walter had been less than 18 hours out of open-heart surgery. Damien stared quietly. Who approved visitation that late? Excellent question. Evelyn slid over another sheet. Medication records. Morphine administered at 10:58 p.m. Additional sedative support at 11:21 p.m. The timestamp sat there plainly. Cold facts. No emotional language required. Evelyn folded her arms. If Brandon obtained signatures during that window, any competent judge will become extremely interested. Damien studied the papers carefully. No anger yet, just structure, like assembling engine parts in the correct order. What about Walter's signature itself? Still waiting on document comparison. You think he signed something? Evelyn gave him a long look. I think Brandon didn't carry portfolios into cardiac recovery rooms for fun. Outside the office, impact guns rattled while customers discussed oil changes near the front counter. Ordinary life again. Yet inside the room, something irreversible had begun forming. A legal trail. Damien leaned back slowly. Walter still doesn't fully understand. No, Evelyn agreed. But he's starting to feel something's wrong. That mattered, because instincts often reached people before evidence did. Evelyn continued sorting papers. I also spoke with a contact at Fifth Third Bank. Damien looked up, and Carter Medical Supply attempted emergency restructuring discussions before Walter's surgery. With Brandon, yes. Approved? Not exactly. Evelyn slid another document across the desk. Preliminary financing denial notice. Certain risk exposure concerns prevent immediate approval. Damien scanned the rest silently. Pierce Strategic Capital lacked sufficient liquid collateral, meaning Brandon needed Carter Medical Supply desperately, not casually, urgently. That explained everything: the speed, the pressure, the hospital visits, the emotional insertion into Vanessa's life. Damien exhaled slowly. He's cornered financially. Likely. And Vanessa Evelyn paused before answering. That's more complicated. Damien waited. She may genuinely believe Brandon is saving the company, and if he isn't, then she attached herself emotionally to a man whose stability depends on controlling her father's business. The office went quiet. Damien remembered Vanessa years earlier, before the expensive networking events and polished social circles. Back when she sat beside him on folding chairs at county car shows, eating hot dogs from food trucks. Back when ambition still looked human instead of strategic. Evelyn interrupted his thoughts. You still care about her, Damien answered honestly. Yes, that makes this dangerous. Why? Because people protecting feelings make slower decisions than people protecting facts. Before Damien could answer, his phone vibrated across the desk. Unknown number. He answered calmly. Damien Simmons. Heavy breathing first, then Walter Carter's weak voice. Kid, you busy? Damien straightened immediately. No. You okay? Can you come by later? Evelyn watched him carefully now. Walter lowered his voice. I need to ask you something without everybody else talking over me. That mattered. A lot. Damien glanced toward Evelyn briefly. What time? Evening. Another pause, then Walter added quietly. And don't tell Vanessa. The line disconnected. Evelyn leaned back in her chair slowly. Well? Damien stared at the phone. He knows. Not everything Evelyn corrected, but enough. She stood and walked toward the office window overlooking the garage. Rain clouds gathered again over Columbus outside. Traffic moved slowly along East Fifth Avenue. People buying coffee. People arguing over parking spots. People living ordinary days while hidden wars developed quietly inside offices and hospital rooms. Evelyn spoke without turning around. There's something else. Damien waited. I checked Pierce Strategic Capital litigation exposure in federal filings, and One sealed dispute involved unauthorized movement of operational reserve funds. Damien frowned. Meaning theft. Meaning money disappeared somewhere. She finally turned back toward him. And if Brandon is financially desperate enough, Carter Medical Supply may not just be an investment target. The implication settled heavily. It might be survival. For Brandon. Which made him more dangerous. Desperate men escalated faster when cornered. Nathan knocked lightly on the office door. Customer here for the Silverado pickup. Damien nodded once. 5 minutes. Nathan disappeared again. Evelyn gathered the hospital photos into neat stacks. You need to understand something very clearly now. Damien looked at her. If Brandon senses Walter pulling away emotionally, he'll accelerate pressure, meaning more paperwork, more manipulation, faster decisions. Damien stood slowly from the chair. And if he realizes lawyers are involved, Evelyn's expression hardened slightly. Then he'll start protecting himself. The fluorescent office lights buzzed softly overhead. Somewhere beyond the garage walls, thunder rolled low across Columbus. Damien looked again at the hospital images. 11:42 p.m. 11:58 p.m. 12:16 a.m. A man carrying paperwork into a medicated patient's room during restricted hours. Not proof yet, but close. Very close. Then Damien noticed something in the final still image that Evelyn hadn't mentioned yet. A second figure partially visible near the doorway. Female silhouette. Long coat, standing beside Brandon. Damien looked up slowly. Vanessa was there. Evelyn nodded once. Yes. And for the first time since this entire situation began, Damien stopped wondering whether Vanessa was simply naive, because people standing beside wrongdoing long enough eventually became part of it too. Franklin County Court of Common Pleas smelled faintly of old paper floor polish and stale coffee. Damien arrived at 8:12 Monday morning wearing the same charcoal suit his father had worn to funerals and union meetings for nearly 15 years. The sleeves fit slightly too broad. The tie was plain black. The leather shoes had fresh polish but permanent creases across the toes. Nothing about him looked expensive, but unlike Brandon Pierce, Damien did not dress to create impressions. He dressed to stand still comfortably under pressure. Evelyn Brooks met him outside courtroom 4B carrying 2 legal boxes and a tablet. You sleep a little. Good. Exhausted people volunteer emotions. Damien glanced through the hallway crowd. Lawyers, clerks, bailiffs, defendants pretending calm, families whispering nervously beside vending machines. And 20 feet away, Vanessa stood beside Brandon Pierce near the courtroom doors. Brandon wore a dark navy suit again. Different Rolex today, silver tie clip. Every detail selected intentionally. Vanessa looked pale beneath carefully applied makeup. She had not posted on social media since Friday. Interesting. Brandon noticed Damien first. Of course he did. Men obsessed with control constantly scanned rooms for threats. He smiled immediately and walked over. Morning, Damien. Damien nodded once. Brandon. Vanessa stayed behind him slightly. That detail mattered too. Not beside. Behind. Brandon kept his tone casual. This filing seems unnecessary. Evelyn answered before Damien could. Most legal actions feel unnecessary to people benefiting from ambiguity. Brandon's smile thinned slightly. I'm trying to save a struggling company. Evelyn adjusted her glasses. At midnight hospital visits with medicated patients, Vanessa stepped in quickly. Nothing illegal happened. Evelyn looked directly at her. That confidence suggests you already know what evidence we have. Silence. Beautiful silence. Because innocent people usually ask what evidence exists. Only nervous people assume it's damaging immediately. Brandon recovered first. This is emotional retaliation from a failed relationship. Damien finally spoke. No. Brandon looked at him carefully. No. This stopped being personal when paperwork entered a recovery ward. That landed. Vanessa looked away instantly. The courtroom doors opened. Counselors inside, a bailiff announced. The hearing itself moved fast initially. Procedural arguments, standing disputes, preliminary injunction language, dry legal structure wrapping around very human betrayal. Judge Miriam Holloway presided from the bench with sharp eyes and zero patience for theatrics. Early 60s, former commercial litigation attorney, the kind of judge who noticed details before lawyers finished speaking. Damien respected her immediately. Brandon's attorney, Richard Levin, stood first. Tall. Expensive haircut. Voice built for country clubs and juries. Your Honor. This entire filing stems from emotional instability following a terminated romantic relationship. Classic strategy, reduce everything to jealousy, make Damien look wounded instead of observant. Levin continued smoothly. Mr. Simmons has no operational role within Carter Medical Supply and no standing regarding private restructuring discussions. Judge Holloway looked down briefly at the filings. Yet, he financed emergency medical care for the company owner immediately before disputed financial activities occurred. Levin smiled politely. A generous personal gesture does not create corporate authority. Evelyn rose slowly beside Damien. No, she agreed calmly. But it creates proximity to fraud when the recipient becomes incapacitated during asset transfer attempts. The courtroom shifted slightly then. Tiny movement. Attention sharpening. Richard Levin kept smiling. There is no evidence of fraud. Evelyn opened the first legal box. Excellent. Then documentation should simplify today considerably. Damien watched Brandon carefully across the courtroom, still composed outwardly, but less relaxed than before. His fingers tapped once against the table. Small movement. Stress leaking through polish. Evelyn approached the bench. Your Honor, we submit timeline documentation establishing 3 critical facts. She held up the first document. Fact 1. Mr. Simmons transferred $86,417 directly to Riverside Methodist Hospital for Walter Carter's emergency surgery. Second document. Fact 2. Mr. Pierce initiated restructuring activities less than 24 hours after surgery. Third document. Fact 3. These activities occurred while Mr. Carter remained under active postoperative sedation protocols. Judge Holloway reviewed the papers silently. Levin stood again immediately. There is still no evidence any signatures were obtained improperly. Evelyn nodded once. Not yet. That phrase changed the air inside the courtroom instantly. Not yet, meaning more was coming. Judge Holloway leaned slightly forward. Counselor Brooks, are you suggesting additional evidence exists? Evelyn remained perfectly calm. We are awaiting authenticated hospital surveillance retrieval and medication administration verification. Across the room, Vanessa's face lost color. Brandon remained still. Too still now. Damien noticed that too. People controlling panic often overcorrect physically. Levin tried redirecting immediately. This is speculative intimidation designed to interfere with legitimate restructuring negotiations. Evelyn turned toward him smoothly. Then your client should welcome transparency regarding midnight hospital visits. Silence again. Judge Holloway looked toward Brandon directly for the first time. Mr. Pierce, were you present in Mr. Carter's recovery room during restricted visitation hours? Levin answered immediately instead. My client supported the family during a medical crisis. Not a denial, the judge noticed. So did Damien. Judge Holloway's eyes narrowed slightly. I asked Mr. Pierce. Brandon finally stood, confident posture mostly intact. Yes, Your Honor. Why family support? While carrying legal documents. Very small pause. Levin stepped forward quickly. Objection to characterization. Overruled. Judge Holloway said instantly. Her eyes never left Brandon. Did you bring business paperwork into the recovery ward? Brandon answered carefully now. Preliminary operational materials may have been discussed. Vanessa closed her eyes briefly. There it was, not denial anymore. Controlled admission. Evelyn spoke quietly. With a medicated cardiac patient less than 24 hours post-surgery, Levin objected again. Judge Holloway ignored him. Instead, she turned toward Evelyn. You mentioned surveillance retrieval. Yes, Your Honor. Do you possess it currently? Hospital Legal Administration confirmed preservation this morning. Interesting wording. Not possession. Preservation. meaning evidence existed but remained pending official release. Judge Holloway understood immediately. So we may soon clarify timing precisely. Yes. The judge leaned back slightly. Courtroom silence deepened. Damien watched Brandon now. For the first time since Riverside Hospital, genuine uncertainty crossed the investor's face. Quick, controlled, but real. Levin attempted one final push. Your Honor, this is still fundamentally emotional conflict disguised as commercial concern. Judge Holloway looked directly at Damien then. Mr. Simmons. Damien straightened slightly. You financed Mr. Carter's surgery. Yes, ma'am. Why, simple question. Yet the courtroom felt suddenly very quiet, waiting for the answer. Damien spoke calmly. Because Vanessa called me crying at 1 a.m, saying her father would die without immediate surgery. No dramatic tone, no bitterness, just truth. Judge Holloway studied him for several seconds. And when did you learn Mr. Pierce was involved with Miss Carter recovery room? A faint reaction moved through the courtroom audience behind them. Even Levin stopped speaking for a moment. The judge glanced toward Vanessa now. Miss Carter avoided eye contact entirely. Interesting. Judge Holloway folded both hands together. This court has significant concerns regarding potential coercive financial activity involving a medically compromised individual. Levin immediately rose again. Your Honor, I'm not finished. The courtroom froze. Judge Holloway continued calmly. Pending review of surveillance materials and medication records, this court issues temporary restraint against execution of any ownership transfer, restructuring authority, or operational control modifications involving Carter Medical Supply. There it was. First real crack. Levin objected immediately. Brandon stayed silent now, very silent, because he understood exactly what temporary restraints meant. Delay, scrutiny, discovery. Evelyn sat beside Damien again without visible emotion, but he noticed the tiny satisfaction in her eyes. Controlled victory. The hearing adjourned 20 minutes later. People began filing out slowly beneath murmured conversations and shuffling paperwork. Brandon approached before Damien could leave. No smile this time. Interesting. You're making a mistake, Brandon said quietly. Damien buttoned his suit jacket calmly. Maybe. You think this ends well for anyone? Damien looked at him steadily. You brought contracts into a cardiac recovery ward. Brandon's jaw tightened. You don't understand business. No, Damien said softly. I understand timing. For the first time, Brandon had no polished response ready. And as Damien walked out of Franklin County Courthouse beside Evelyn Brooks, he realized something important. Brandon Pierce no longer looked like a man managing a situation. He looked like a man calculating damage. The hallway outside courtroom 4B felt colder after the hearing. Not because the temperature changed, because control had. People dispersed in uneven patterns, lawyers speaking faster than before, clients walking slower than they arrived, phones already pressed to ears, as if everyone was trying to rebuild versions of the story in real time. Damien stood near the courthouse exit while Evelyn Brooks stepped aside to take a call from her office. For the first time that morning, Brandon Pierce wasn't speaking. He stood 20 feet away near a marble pillar with Vanessa beside him, but the distance between them looked different now. Smaller physically, larger structurally. Vanessa kept checking her phone. Brandon kept his gaze forward. Neither of them spoke until Damien began walking toward the exit. That's when Brandon moved. Damien! Damien stopped but didn't turn fully. Brandon approached with slower steps this time. Less confident, more measured. You think that hearing means something, Brandon said? Damien finally faced him. It already did. Brandon gave a short, controlled laugh. You really believe a judge is going to unravel a company over hospital timing? Damien studied him quietly. No, he said. I believe patterns do that. That answer landed differently. Brandon's expression tightened slightly. Vanessa stepped closer behind him, hesitant now. Damien, she said softly, this is going too far. He looked at her. For a moment there was something almost familiar in her face again. Not the polished version from the guild house, not the hospital version, something in between. But it disappeared quickly. Because Brandon spoke again. Your mechanic friend is turning a family crisis into legal theater. Damien nodded once. Funny, he said. That's what I thought when someone walked into a recovery room with contracts. Brandon's eyes sharpened. Careful. Damien didn't react. That silence again. The kind that didn't need volume to feel heavy. Evelyn's voice called from behind them. Damien! He turned. She gestured subtly toward the parking structure. We need to go. He nodded. Before walking away, Damien looked at Vanessa one last time. Not anger, not pleading, just observation. You should ask your father about the timing of signatures, he said quietly. Vanessa's lips parted slightly, but no words came. Brandon stepped forward half a pace. Don't contact her directly again without counsel. Damien paused, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Noted, and walked away. The drive back to Simmons Auto and Restoration was silent. Rain had started again, thin and steady, forming blurred streaks across the windshield of Damien's F-15O. Evelyn sat in the passenger seat, reviewing notes on her tablet. You held your ground well in there, she said without looking up. I didn't do much. That's exactly why it worked. Damien glanced at her. Evelyn continued. Brandon expected emotion, anger, collapse, anything reactive, and I didn't give him that. No, she said. You gave him something worse. Damien didn't respond. Evelyn tapped the screen once. The judge noticed his hesitation. He hesitated. Yes, she said, twice. And that matters in financial coercion cases. The truck passed beneath a highway overpass, momentarily dimming the interior. Damien's hand stayed steady on the wheel. What happens next? Evelyn leaned back slightly. Now he either escalates legally or tries to settle quietly. And Vanessa. Evelyn paused for a fraction of a second. She's already caught in the middle of two narratives she didn't realize were competing. Damien kept his eyes on the road. That sounds dangerous. It is, Evelyn said. For her stability. Not yours. That distinction mattered more than it should have. They drove the rest of the way without speaking. Back at the garage, Nathan immediately sensed the shift. You look like someone won something ugly, he said while wiping his hands on a rag. Damien walked past him. Court hearing. Nathan frowned. That went well or badly? Both, Damien said simply. Evelyn headed straight into the office again without stopping. Damien followed. Inside, she placed her tablet on Frank Simmons' desk. We're going to need to prepare for document escalation, she said, meaning more filings. Meaning Brandon will now either delay aggressively or flood the court with counter-narratives. Damien sat down slowly. So he fights harder? Yes, because he lost control. Evelyn nodded. That's usually the trigger point. Damien leaned back slightly. And if he's desperate, Evelyn looked at him directly. Then mistakes happen. That word again. Mistakes. Not crimes. Not schemes. Mistakes. The legal way of describing panic. Damien's phone buzzed on the desk. Unknown number. He stared at it for a moment, then answered. Damien Simmons. A pause. Then Brandon's voice, calmer than expected, but thinner underneath. We should talk privately. Damien didn't respond immediately. Evelyn watched him carefully. Brandon continued. Not through attorneys, not through filings. Another pause. I think you understand this is becoming unnecessarily complicated. Damien finally spoke. You brought paperwork into a hospital room. Silence on the line. Then Brandon carefully, that is not how it will be interpreted in the final record. Damien looked at Evelyn. She gave a slight nod. Keep him talking. Damien continued. How will it be interpreted then? Another pause. Then Brandon's voice shifted slightly, less controlled now, more direct. As a misunderstanding during a family emergency. Damien almost smiled. That's interesting wording, because it's accurate. No, Damien said quietly, because it's useful. Silence again. Longer this time. Then Brandon spoke more carefully. What do you want from this? Damien leaned forward slightly. Honesty mattered now. I want the truth recorded properly. A short laugh came through the phone. That's not how business works, Damien replied calmly. Then maybe you're in the wrong business. Another pause. Then Brandon changed direction. Vanessa is emotionally overwhelmed. You're escalating a situation she doesn't fully control. That sentence hit differently because it revealed strategy again. Not defense. Redirection. Damien answered slowly. She called me at 1 a.m. crying for help. That was before she understood the full context. No, Damien said. That was before you arrived. Silence. Evelyn leaned forward slightly now, listening more closely. Brandon's tone sharpened. You're assuming intent you cannot prove. Damien looked down at the desk. I don't need assumptions. Then what I have timing. A pause. That word again. Brandon didn't respond immediately. When he finally did, the calm was back, but forced. Careful, Damien. For the first time, the threat was no longer hidden. Not aggressive, just present. Damien replied evenly, You too, and ended the call. The office went quiet. Evelyn exhaled slowly. He's cornered, she said. Damien looked up. We're calculating next move. Same thing, she replied. Outside the garage, thunder rolled again over Columbus. Nathan shouted something from the service bay, but Damien didn't hear it clearly. He was still thinking about Brandon's last tone shift. Not anger, not denial, control slipping. Evelyn gathered her documents again. Tomorrow we push for formal discovery motion, she said. Damien nodded, then looked toward the empty corner of the garage where the Mustang used to sit. The space didn't feel empty anymore. It felt watched. And somewhere in that realization, Damien understood something clearly for the first time since this began. Brandon Pierce was no longer building a plan. He was reacting to one. The Fifth Third Bank building downtown Columbus looked the same as it always did, glass exterior, clean lobby, quiet security presence. But inside the executive conference room on the 14th floor, nothing felt routine. Damien sat at the far end of a polished oak table. Evelyn Brooks sat beside him. Across from them were 2 bank officials and Nathan Doyle, the accountant Evelyn had brought in earlier. And for the first time since the courthouse, Vanessa Carter was not in the room. Only Brandon Pierce was. He arrived 10 minutes late. No apology. Just a brief nod as he took his seat like delays were a normal extension of authority. Brandon placed a slim black folder on the table. Confident again. Rebuilt. Or pretending to be. Let's keep this productive, he said smoothly. The bank officer, a middle-aged woman named Carla Jennings, adjusted her glasses. We're here to clarify recent activity involving Carter Medical Supply LLC accounts and associated restructuring proposals. Brandon nodded. Correct. Evelyn slid a single document forward. We'll start with this. The room shifted slightly. Damien didn't speak. He didn't need to. Evelyn did what she always did. She let silence apply pressure before words did. This is a UCC preliminary filing submitted 72 hours after Mr. Carter's surgery, she said. Brandon responded instantly. As part of standard restructuring preparation. Evelyn looked up. Submitted while the owner was under post-operative sedation. Brandon's expression didn't change. That timing is irrelevant. Not to this court record, Evelyn replied. The bank officer glanced down at the document again. Nathan Doyle leaned slightly forward, studying figures on his tablet. Damien watched Brandon carefully. Still controlled, still polished, but not as relaxed as before. Evelyn continued. This filing establishes secured creditor positioning over assets that were not disclosed to Mr. Carter in any informed capacity. Brandon finally leaned back. Walter Carter was advised. By whom, Evelyn asked immediately. A pause. Too long. Brandon chose his words carefully. Consultants working with the family. Damien finally spoke for the first time in the room. While he was under medication, Brandon turned toward him. Medical status does not eliminate financial necessity. That answer was technically correct and carefully evasive. Evelyn tapped the second document. Then explain this. A bank account ledger appeared on the screen. Outgoing transfers. Multiple entries, all tied to Pierce Strategic Capital accounts. The bank officer leaned closer. These transfers were not disclosed in initial restructuring disclosures, she said. Brandon nodded. Bridge capital movement. Evelyn interrupted. To cover what silence? Brandon adjusted his cufflink. To stabilize liquidity. Damien noticed it again. The phrasing shift. Never direct, always abstract. Evelyn leaned forward slightly. Or to cover prior obligations, Brandon looked at her. No. The answer came too quickly this time. Evelyn didn't react. Instead, she turned the laptop toward the bank officer. Then perhaps you can explain why Pierce Strategic Capital liquidated 2 commercial assets within the same 30-day window. The room went quiet. Nathan glanced at Damien. Damien didn't move. The bank officer frowned. We weren't provided notice of these asset sales in the restructuring overview. Brandon spoke calmly. Those assets were unrelated to Carter Medical Supply. Evelyn nodded slowly. That's correct? A pause. Then, but they were used to fund your entry into Carter Medical Supply discussions. That sentence landed harder than the previous ones. Brandon's jaw tightened slightly. Damien saw it clearly now. Pressure points were forming. Evelyn continued. The financial model you presented to Mr. Carter shows projected stabilization based on capital that no longer exists in your liquidity structure. Brandon finally leaned forward again. That model is based on anticipated returns. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. From a company whose owner is currently medically recovering and legally unable to confirm authorization. The bank officer looked uncomfortable now. Nathan spoke quietly. This structure looks highly leveraged. Brandon turned toward him sharply. You're not part of this conversation. Nathan didn't back down. Neither is solvency risk without transparency. That was enough. The room shifted again. Damien noticed Carla Jennings exchange a glance with her colleague. Bank personnel were no longer neutral observers. They were assessing exposure. Brandon exhaled slowly. This is becoming adversarial. Evelyn replied without hesitation. It became adversarial when hospital paperwork entered restricted medical conditions. Silence followed, heavy, controlled. Damien finally spoke again. Where is Walter's written approval? Brandon looked at him. He gave verbal authorization. Evelyn immediately responded, to whom Brandon paused. Family representatives. Vanessa. Damien understood instantly. Evelyn did too. Was Mr. Carter informed of equity implications, she asked. Brandon didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched. Then, not in formal legal terms. The bank officer removed her pen from the table slowly. Nathan leaned back slightly. Damien watched everything. The structure was collapsing in layers now. Not explosive, systematic. Evelyn stood. Then, this is not restructuring. Brandon's eyes narrowed slightly. Excuse me, this is attempted control acquisition under non-informed consent conditions. The phrase hung in the air. Legally precise. Intentionally sharp. The bank officer cleared her throat. We will need to pause all account movement pending review. Brandon turned toward her. That is not necessary. It is, she said calmly. That was it. The shift. Control leaving his hands. Not fully gone, but slipping. Damien saw it in Brandon's posture immediately. Subtle tightening, small breath adjustment, the moment when strategy no longer matched reality. Brandon gathered his folder slowly. This is being misinterpreted, Evelyn responded softly. No, it is being interpreted correctly for the first time. That line landed heavily. Brandon looked at Damien directly. You think you've won something here, Damien answered calmly. I don't think about winning. Then what do you think about? Damien paused. Consequences. Silence again. Brandon stood, smooth again, but thinner now. We'll resolve this legally. Evelyn nodded. That's the first accurate statement you've made today. Brandon left the room without shaking hands. Vanessa was not there to see it, but she would hear about it soon. Everyone in Columbus financial circles eventually heard everything. After the door closed, the bank officer spoke quietly. We are freezing all non-essential transfers tied to Carter Medical Supply until full audit completion. Nathan exhaled slowly. Evelyn closed her laptop. Damien didn't move. He only looked at the empty chair Brandon had just occupied. And for the first time, the pressure shifted direction. Not toward him, toward Brandon. Outside the bank, rain had stopped. The streets of downtown Columbus reflected soft evening light across wet pavement. Damien stood beside Evelyn on the sidewalk. Nathan had already left. Evelyn lit a cigarette despite repeatedly claiming she quit. "You did well in there," she said. "I didn't do much." "That's why it worked." Damien looked toward the street. Now Evelyn exhaled smoke slowly. Now he reacts. Damien turned slightly. "That's dangerous." "It can be," she said. "If desperation meets ego." Damien understood immediately. Brandon Pierce had both. They stood in silence for a moment, then Evelyn added quietly, "One more thing." Damien waited. "Walter Carter is going to receive notice of financial irregularities within 24 hours. Damien nodded. "That will change everything." "Yes," Evelyn said, "but not in the way Brandon expects." Damien looked toward the distant hospital skyline. Riverside Methodist sat somewhere beyond those buildings. Walter recovering, Vanessa caught between versions of truth, and Brandon Pierce somewhere recalculating his next move. Evelyn tapped ashes into a cup. He thought he was entering a quiet restructuring. Damien spoke softly. "And it isn't." Evelyn looked at him. "No, it's a collapse." They walked toward the parking structure without speaking further. And behind them inside the financial systems, they had just destabilized something large and carefully built began to crack under its own assumptions. Walter Carter called Damien at 5:47 a.m. Not Vanessa. Not Brandon. "Walter." Damien answered before the second ring finished. "Kid, you awake? I am now." Walter's breathing sounded heavier than before, but steadier than the hospital machines had suggested days earlier. "I need you to come by the house," Walter said. A pause. "Not the hospital. Home." Damien sat up on the edge of his bed inside the small apartment above Simmons Auto and Restoration. "I'll be there in an hour." "No," Walter said quickly. "Tonight. After dark. And don't tell Vanessa." That last part changed Damien's posture immediately. He stood. Why Walter didn't answer directly. Instead, his voice lowered. "There are things I should have asked questions about earlier." Silence followed. Damien understood without being told. Something had shifted inside Walter Carter. Awareness arriving late, but arriving fully. "I'll come," Damien said quietly. The line ended. By 7:12 p.m., Damien parked outside Walter Carter's house in Upper Arlington. A modest two-story brick home. Well-kept lawn. No luxury but comfort. Vanessa grew up here. Before corporate meetings, before investors, before Brandon Pierce. Walter opened the door before Damien knocked. He looked thinner than in the hospital, but his posture was different. More upright, more alert, less sedated. "Come in," Walter said. Inside the house smelled like herbal tea and old wood furniture. Vanessa's childhood photos still lined the hallway. Damien noticed something immediately as he stepped inside. No Brandon, no Vanessa, just Walter. That mattered. Walter closed the door slowly behind him. "I saw something today," he said. Damien didn't sit yet. Walter walked toward the living room table. A stack of printed documents sat there. Bank notices, legal summaries, Evelyn Brooks filings, and something else. A hospital discharge report. Damien frowned slightly. "Where did you get those?" Walter sat down heavily. "From Vanessa." That name landed quietly in the room. Not dramatic, but dense. Walter rubbed his forehead slowly. "She said everything was routine," he muttered. "Just restructuring. Temporary adjustments. Standard investor support." Damien remained standing. Walter looked up at him. "Then why did a bank officer call me this morning asking if I authorized emergency secured creditor positioning while I was under sedation silence?" Heavy. Direct. Damien didn't answer immediately. Walter continued. "They said my signature appeared on preliminary restructuring authority." Another pause. "I don't remember signing anything." That was the moment everything narrowed. Not suspicion anymore. Confirmation-seeking structure. Damien finally spoke. "Did you see the documents yourself?" Walter pushed the papers forward. "I saw copies." Damien scanned them. The signature line was there. Familiar, but not consistent. Not fully stable. Not like Walter's usual handwriting. Walter watched him carefully. "You think it's fake?" Damien chose his words carefully. I think timing matters more than ink. Walter exhaled slowly. That lawyer woman? Evelyn? She showed me the hospital timeline. Damien nodded. Walter continued. And then I remembered something. He tapped the table lightly. Brandon wasn't just there to help Vanessa. Damien stayed silent. Walter looked up. He was there before I even woke up from surgery. That detail mattered, because before awareness meant before consent. Walter leaned forward slightly. Why would someone need that much access during recovery? Damien answered honestly. To move decisions faster than clarity arrives. Walter nodded slowly. That's what it felt like. Silence stretched again. Then Walter said something Damien didn't expect. I trusted him because Vanessa trusted him. That sentence carried weight. Not blame, just realization. Walter leaned back in the chair. My daughter thinks I'm old-fashioned, he said quietly. She thinks I don't understand modern finance. He shook his head slightly. But I understand pressure when I see it. Damien finally sat across from him. What do you want from me? Walter looked directly at him. Truth. Simple. Direct. No corporate language left. I need to know if I was manipulated. Damien didn't answer immediately, because answering meant confirming what Walter already suspected. Before Damien could respond, the front door opened. Vanessa Carter stepped inside. She stopped immediately when she saw Damien, then Walter, then the documents. Her expression changed instantly. Dad Walter didn't speak right away. Vanessa looked at Damien sharply. What are you doing here? Walter raised one hand slightly. I called him. That silenced her. Vanessa slowly walked further into the room. Her heels clicked against hardwood floors. She looked tired. Not glamorous now, just worn. Why, she asked quietly. Walter pushed the documents toward her. Because I'm being asked questions I can't answer. Vanessa looked down. The color drained slightly from her face. Damien watched carefully. Not anger, not accusation, just observation. Walter continued. The bank thinks I signed things I don't remember signing. Vanessa shook her head quickly. That's not what happened. Walter looked at her. Then what happened? Silence. Brandon Pierce wasn't in the room, but his influence was. Damien could feel it in Vanessa's hesitation, in the phrasing, in the pause before truth. Vanessa finally spoke. Brandon was trying to stabilize things. Walter nodded slowly. And my signature Vanessa didn't answer immediately. That was the answer. Walter leaned back. During recovery, Vanessa's voice dropped. He said it was urgent. Walter closed his eyes briefly. Damien saw something shift inside him then. Not anger, disappointment. Heavy and quiet. I was awake enough to sign papers, Walter asked. Vanessa hesitated. He said you understood everything. Damien noticed Walter's hands tighten slightly on the armrest. That detail mattered. Vanessa turned toward Damien suddenly. This is because of you, she said. Damien looked at her calmly. No. You pushed lawyers into this. No. Damien repeated. Brandon did that the moment he brought contracts into a hospital room. Vanessa's voice sharpened. You don't understand what he's trying to do for this company. Walter interrupted quietly. Is he trying to save it? A pause. Or control? Control it. That question hung in the air. Vanessa didn't respond immediately, and that hesitation answered more than words could. Walter looked down at the table again. I built Carter Medical Supply over 30 years, he said quietly. Not to be controlled by someone I met during surgery recovery. Vanessa's eyes reddened slightly. That's not fair. Walter looked up. Then explain it to me clearly. Silence again. The house felt smaller suddenly, less like a home, more like a decision point. Damien stood slowly. I shouldn't be here for this, he said quietly. Walter shook his head. No. You should. Vanessa turned toward him sharply. What does that mean? Walter answered before Damien could. It means he's the only one who paid for my surgery without asking for anything in return. That landed differently. Vanessa froze slightly. Walter continued. And I think I need to understand why the people who talked the most about helping me needed me the least stable to sign anything. Silence again. Damien looked at Walter carefully, then at Vanessa. And for the first time, he saw something fully break inside her expression. Not rage, not denial, but recognition that control over the narrative was slipping completely out of reach. Outside headlights passed slowly along the street, life continuing. Unaware of how quietly a family structure was changing inside a small brick house in Upper Arlington, Walter finally spoke again. "I want all documents reviewed independently," Vanessa whispered. "Dad!" "No," Walter said firmly. "No more interpreting for me." That was the shift. Final. Damien saw it immediately. Walter Carter was no longer a passive patient in someone else's financial story. He was becoming a witness, and witnesses changed everything. Vanessa turned away slowly. Her phone vibrated in her hand. She didn't check it immediately, but Damien already knew who it was. Brandon Pierce, waiting, watching, adjusting. Walter stood slowly from the chair. "I think I understand what's happening now," he said quietly. No anger, just clarity forming late. Then he looked at Damien. "And I think you've been standing in the middle of it longer than you should have been." Damien didn't respond, because for the first time there was nothing left to explain, only consequences waiting to unfold. The message from Brandon Pierce arrived at 2:03 a.m. Damien saw it when his phone lit up on the nightstand. "We need to talk. Alone. Tomorrow morning." No greeting, no apology, no explanation. Just control attempting to reset itself. Damien stared at the screen for a long moment before locking it again. Some negotiations were no longer negotiations. They were damage assessments. At 9:15, A.M. Simmons Auto and Restoration opened as usual. Nathan was already replacing brake pads on a customer's Ford Fusion when Damien walked in. Nathan looked up immediately. "You look like you didn't sleep." "I didn't." That bad Damien didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed a clean rag and wiped his hands out of habit. But there was nothing to clean, only routine. Evelyn Brooks arrived 10 minutes later. She didn't knock this time. She walked straight into the office holding a thin folder. "You got the message too," she said. "Yes." Evelyn placed the folder on Frank Simmons' old desk. "He wants a private meeting." Damien looked at her. "That's not surprising." "No," she said. "What's surprising is the timing." She opened the folder. Inside was a printed email thread. Brandon Pierce requesting immediate off-record discussion with Walter Carter present only. Damien frowned slightly. Walter said, "No lawyers." "Walter didn't send this," Evelyn said. "Brandon did." Silence. That mattered. Evelyn leaned forward slightly. "He's trying to isolate the narrative again." Damien crossed his arms. Why now Evelyn looked at him directly? Because he lost control of documentation flow. That was true. Court filings, bank freeze, medical timeline exposure, everything had shifted. Brandon was no longer shaping events, he was reacting to them. Evelyn continued. "He needs direct access to Walter before independent review solidifies." Damien understood immediately. If Walter reviews everything with full context, then Brandon loses leverage completely. Evelyn finished. Damien looked toward the garage floor. "So he wants one more conversation." "Yes," Evelyn said. "Without me. Without court oversight. Without bank supervision." Nathan walked past the office door holding a wrench, but slowed when he noticed the tension inside. "Everything okay?" he asked cautiously. Damien nodded. "Just business." Nathan didn't look convinced, but left anyway. Evelyn closed the folder. "There's something else." Damien looked at her again. "I spoke with hospital administration this morning, and they've confirmed a second after-hours visitation entry log that wasn't initially disclosed." Damien's expression tightened slightly. "Brandon again." Evelyn nodded. But this time, she hesitated briefly. Vanessa was officially recorded as accompanying him. That detail landed differently. Damien said nothing immediately. Evelyn continued. "This matters legally because it changes perceived intent from individual manipulation to coordinated family access." Damien finally spoke. "So now it looks like she was involved." "Yes." Silence followed. Not heavy, just realignment. Damien rubbed his jaw slowly. "She's going to deny it." "She already did," Evelyn said. "But records don't care about denial." Damien stared at the desk. The garage noise outside continued like nothing had changed. Air compressor cycling, metal clanging, a radio playing faintly in the background. But everything inside the office felt recalibrated. Evelyn tapped the folder once. If Brandon meets Walter alone tomorrow, he will try to reframe everything. Reframe how as confusion, stress, miscommunication during recovery. Damien looked at her, and Walter Evelyn paused. Walter is no longer confused. That mattered, because clarity in the wrong direction was dangerous. Damien stood slowly. I'll go. Evelyn frowned. To the meeting? Yes. That's exactly what he wants, emotional reaction. I'm not reacting, Damien said quietly. I'm observing. Evelyn studied him carefully, then nodded once. Fine. But you do not engage directly unless spoken to. Damien gave a small nod. The meeting was scheduled for 11 a.m. at a private conference room inside the Dresden Building downtown. Neutral location, corporate environment. Brandon's preference. Damien arrived first. He didn't sit. He stood near the glass wall overlooking Columbus traffic below. Evelyn arrived 5 minutes later. Walter Carter arrived at 10:58. He moved slower than before but steadier. No hospital gown now. No IV lines. Just a dark coat and tired eyes that had shifted from confusion into something sharper. Recognition. Vanessa arrived last. She didn't look at Damien, not once. At 11 o'clock exactly, Brandon Pierce entered. Same suit structure, same controlled posture. But Damien noticed something immediately. Less confidence in the eyes, more calculation in the movement. Brandon sat first. Let's make this simple, he said. Evelyn remained standing. Walter didn't sit immediately. Damien stayed near the window. Brandon looked at Walter. You've received a lot of conflicting information recently. Walter didn't respond. Brandon continued. Hospital recovery periods are notoriously confusing. Medication affects memory. Family members sometimes misunderstand administrative processes. He spoke like a man rebuilding reality one sentence at a time. Evelyn interrupted calmly. Or documentation reflects accurate timestamps. Brandon didn't look at her. This is not a legal proceeding. It becomes one the moment signatures are disputed, Evelyn replied. Silence. Brandon exhaled slowly. Walter, he said, turning his attention now. I want to ensure you understand that everything I did was in your company's best interest. Walter finally spoke. No. The single word cut through the room cleanly. Brandon blinked once. I'm sorry. Walter looked directly at him. You were in my hospital room. Brandon smiled slightly. To support your recovery. Walter shook his head slowly. No. You were there to support paperwork. Silence again. Damien watched carefully. Brandon adjusted his posture slightly. That is a misunderstanding. Walter stepped forward one pace. I asked my doctor yesterday about timing of signatures. Vanessa shifted slightly behind Brandon. Damien noticed immediately. Walter continued. They told me I was under medication that affects decision clarity. Brandon's jaw tightened subtly. That doesn't mean you were incapable. Walter nodded. It means I should not have been asked. Silence deepened. Evelyn spoke quietly. And any reasonable restructuring professional would avoid such conditions. Brandon finally looked at her. This is being framed unfairly. Evelyn didn't react. It is being documented accurately. Brandon turned back toward Walter. Do you really believe Damien Simmons is the only unbiased person here? That was the first direct pivot. Walter didn't answer immediately. Brandon continued. He benefits from portraying me as opportunistic. Damien finally spoke from the side of the room. I didn't portray you as anything. Brandon turned toward him. You initiated legal escalation. No, Damien said calmly. I responded to what happened. Vanessa finally spoke. This is destroying everything. Walter looked at her. Or revealing it. That sentence changed the air again. Brandon stood slowly now. You're being influenced. Walter didn't move. No, he said quietly. I'm being informed. Silence. Then Brandon spoke softer. Walter, we can fix this privately. Evelyn stepped forward slightly, meaning no oversight. Brandon ignored her. Just rational business decisions. Walter looked at him for a long moment. then spoke. I think you miscalculated something. Brandon paused. What Walter gestured toward Damien. You assumed I wouldn't compare notes. Silence fell instantly. Brandon's expression changed for the first time. Not anger, not calm, something closer to recognition of loss. Walter continued, and I think you underestimated the people I trusted before you arrived. Vanessa looked down. Brandon exhaled slowly. This is not over. Evelyn nodded once. That is correct. Damien finally stepped forward slightly. It's just starting. Brandon looked at him for a long moment, then at Walter, then at Vanessa, then back at the documents on the table. And for the first time since he entered the room, he didn't immediately respond, because somewhere in the structure he had built something was no longer holding, and everyone in the room could feel it. Brandon Pierce left the Dresden building without shaking hands. He didn't slam the door, he didn't raise his voice. That wasn't his style. Instead, he simply walked out as if the conversation was unfinished and still belonged to him. But Damien noticed something different in his stride this time. Less direction, more calculation, like a man already rewriting his next version of events. The silence that followed in the conference room felt heavier than any argument. Walter Carter remained standing near the table for a long moment after Brandon left. Vanessa didn't move either. Evelyn Brooks slowly closed her folder. Damien stayed by the window watching traffic below continue as if nothing important had happened. Finally, Walter spoke. I built my company on contracts I understood, he said quietly. Not pressure I didn't recognize. Vanessa looked up at him. Dad? Walter raised a hand, gently stopping her. No. I need to finish this. He turned slightly toward Damien. You didn't owe me anything. Damien didn't respond. Walter continued. You still paid anyway. That sentence carried weight in the room, not emotional exaggeration, just fact. Walter exhaled slowly. And I think I let the wrong people explain my own situation to me. Vanessa's face tightened. That's not fair. Walter looked at her not angrily, but firmly. It's accurate. Silence followed again. This time no one rushed to fill it. Evelyn finally spoke. The bank will maintain the freeze until full audit completion, she said. After that, any restructuring must pass independent verification. Brandon's influence was no longer in the room, but his impact still was. Walter nodded slowly. Good. Vanessa looked between all of them. This is going to destroy the company's reputation. Evelyn responded calmly. No, she said. What destroys companies is hidden control. Transparency is uncomfortable, but it stabilizes long-term systems. Damien finally turned away from the window. He looked at Vanessa. For the first time in days, there was no anger in his expression, only clarity. This was never about destroying your family business, he said quietly. It was about stopping someone from taking it while your father couldn't fully defend it. Vanessa shook her head slightly. You made it public. No, Damien replied. Brandon did that when he entered a hospital room with legal paperwork. That sentence didn't land like an attack. It landed like structure. Walter slowly sat down at the table again. His hands rested on the wood surface. I don't want war between anyone, he said quietly. Evelyn nodded. Then don't frame this as war, she said. Frame it as correction. Silence again. But this time it felt different, less tense, more final. Vanessa stepped back slightly, leaning against the edge of the table. Her voice was quieter now. What happens now? Evelyn answered first. Now accountants verify what happened. Lawyers verify what was signed. Banks verify what was authorized. She paused. And then consequences follow structure. Walter looked down at his hands. I should have asked more questions earlier. Damien spoke gently. You were recovering from heart surgery. That doesn't erase responsibility, Walter said. No, Damien agreed, but it explains vulnerability. That word changed something in Walter's expression. Vulnerability. Not weakness, not failure, just human limitation at the wrong time. Vanessa finally spoke again. I didn't know it was happening like this, she said quietly. Evelyn didn't interrupt. Damien didn't either. Walter looked at his daughter. I believe you didn't see the full picture, he said slowly. That wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't rejection either. Vanessa's shoulders loosened slightly. Outside the glass walls of the conference room, Columbus moved on cars, turning people, walking businesses, opening and closing like nothing had shifted at all. But inside that room, something had settled. Not resolved, but defined. 2 weeks later, Simmons Auto and Restoration felt different again. Not louder, not busier, more stable. The legal noise had moved into paperwork channels Evelyn controlled. The bank audits were ongoing. Brandon Pierce had stopped appearing in any official communication channels. Not arrested, not erased, just contained. Damien stood inside the garage early morning watching Nathan align a restored engine block into place. Nathan glanced over. So, that's it. Damien tightened a bolt calmly. That's not how these things end. Nathan frowned. How do they end? Then, Damien looked toward the empty corner of the garage, the space where the Mustang used to sit. Slowly, he said. Nathan nodded like he understood even if he didn't fully. Later that afternoon, Walter Carter visited the garage. No hospital escort, no corporate pressure. Just an older man walking carefully into a space filled with tools, noise, and oil. He stopped near Damien's workbench. This place is smaller than I expected, Walter said. Damien glanced up briefly. It's bigger when it's busy. Walter almost smiled. Almost. He looked around slowly. You saved my life, he said quietly. Damien shook his head once. I paid for surgery, he corrected. Walter nodded. And I let people I shouldn't have speak for me while I was vulnerable. That honesty hung in the air. Walter placed a small envelope on the bench. Damien looked at it. What is this adjusted documentation, Walter said. Cleaned, reviewed, verified. Damien didn't open it yet. Walter continued. And something else. He paused. I want Carter Medical Supply rebuilt properly. Not fast. Not controlled. Properly. Damien finally looked at him fully. That's not my field. Walter nodded. That's why I'm not asking you to run it. A pause. I'm asking you to stay involved enough that people like Brandon can't get close again without scrutiny. Damien didn't answer immediately. Evelyn's voice echoed in his memory. Facts positioned correctly. He understood now what that meant in real life. Not control. Not revenge. Structure, protection. Finally, Damien nodded once. Okay. Walter exhaled slowly. Good. He turned to leave, then stopped. One more thing. Damien looked at him. Walter hesitated. The Mustang. Damien paused. I know, Walter said quietly. You sold it for me. Damien said nothing. Walter nodded once. I'll never forget that. Then he left the garage the same way he entered, slowly, carefully, quietly. No drama, no closure speech, just acknowledgement. That evening, Damien stood alone in the garage after closing hours. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above him. The empty corner space remained where the Mustang used to sit, but it didn't feel hollow anymore. It felt like something had passed through it and left a permanent mark. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered. Damien Simmons. A pause. Then Vanessa's voice, quieter than before. I heard my dad came by. Yes. Another pause. He's different now, she said. Damien didn't respond immediately. Is that bad? He asked. Vanessa hesitated. I don't know yet. Silence stretched. Then she added softly. I didn't see it clearly, Damien. I know, he said. Another pause. I'm sorry, she whispered. Damien looked at the empty garage space. Not the Mustang, not the past. Just the space. I know, he said again. And for the first time since everything started, there was nothing more to argue about. No leverage left to extract. No narrative left to fight over. Just consequences settling into place quietly. Vanessa ended the call. Damien stood there for a long moment afterward, then turned off the lights. The garage went dark. Not empty. Just finished. People rarely lose everything in a single moment. It happens slowly, when trust is replaced with convenience, when truth is delayed by comfort, and when decisions are made while clarity is absent. Damien didn't win because he was louder or more powerful. He won because he stayed consistent when others shifted under pressure. He documented instead of reacting. He observed instead of assuming. And when truth finally mattered, It already existed in a form that could not be erased. In real life, not every betrayal is dramatic. Some are procedural. Some happen in silence through timing signatures and assumptions made during vulnerable moments. The hardest lesson is this: stability is not proven when things are easy. It is proven when pressure arrives and people reveal what they are willing to do with it. Take a moment to think about this in your own life. Have you ever trusted someone's timing more than their intent? Leave your thoughts below. I read every comment. And if you want the next story where control money and quiet revenge collide in an even darker way, subscribe. The next one starts where this silence ends.